Hi guys, welcome to the Church Split. My name is Will, and today we are talking about all the arguments that progressives use to justify. Did I have that muted? I feel like I did. I got to use my mic. All right, guys, welcome to the Church Split. So basically, guys, what we're doing tonight is we are talking about progressive arguments for homosexuality and what they use for the Bible to actually justify homosexuality. And I'm going to go through all the arguments. This is going to be your one-stop shop for the entire show, okay? So that's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about it. And this is a live stream, so if you're watching this in post, I do apologize. Although I did get some feedback on people saying that it can be a little distracting when they're listening to it later, especially if they're really enjoying the Theology of the Body series. So here is what my goal is going to be tonight. If you have questions, save them for the end of the stream. I will have a specific Q&A section, and I am going to try to go back into this video once YouTube uploads it, which takes a little bit for live streams, and add chapters to this as well, so it becomes easier to navigate for all of you. However, I'm going to break the rule that I just said to answer one question that's in the live stream. It's because it's a super chat and it's addressing last stream. So if you are watching this in post, go ahead and fast forward from this if you aren't interested in it. But then after that, I will say, guys, keep the super chats and questions toward the end, or if you throw a super chat in, I won't recognize it right away because I didn't give that prior warning first. And I'm just going to try to not acknowledge the live chat as much as I'm going through these, okay? Just because I have a lot to cover tonight. I have so many notes on this, and it's going to take me a long time to get through it. So this is going to be a one-stop shop video, and we're going to do all that, okay? So guys, thank you for joining me tonight. I really appreciate everyone who's supporting the Theology of the Body series. It's great. But real quick, Osric did a $10 super chat before the show even started, so I'm going to acknowledge this right now, and then we'll go ahead and get moving. He goes, "Hey, Will, I have a question for you. YouTube wants me to unload my entire last paycheck to ask it here, so I'm going to post it in the chat." So apparently, for like longer chats, does it charge you more? I don't know. It's been a while since I've done a super chat, I guess. Hey, Will, I was watching your prior stream the other night and was wondering if you would mind elaborating on Ephesians 5:4, as it's a verse that has of late perplexed me, and you gave a take on it I have never heard before, given the context of it being couched right after matters of sexual discourse. I'd always assumed it was being stated that in the sense of lewd and or generically crass joking. But I found it odd trying to think about how one might define what crass or crude means, given how one's views on such things might shift dependent upon time, culture, and place. But even still, there is a part of me that says this isn't just carte blanche or carte blanche. I've heard it say pronounced other ways. Whatever. All crass joking is okay, even if it doesn't apply there. Wait, so is it part? Hold on, let me reread that. But even still, there's a part of me that says this isn't just carte blanche, all crass joking is okay, even if it doesn't apply there. No, you would. So would you mind elaborating on that? Also, hi, hello. All right. So, all right. Yeah, nice one stop against heresies. Good. And that's what it's going to be. So, all right, Ephesians 5:4. Let me pull that up real quick. And it says, "Let there be no filthiness, nor foolish talk, nor crude joking, which are out of place, but instead let there be thanksgiving." So one of the things that we need to remember when it comes to this, so a lot of people think this means like you can't crack like certain sex jokes or whatever. The Bible's filled with its own, like nowadays, what we would call crassness. I mean, is loaded with it. So I can't say it's a sin because you're supposed to read your Bible. And even the Apostle Paul uses some pretty intense language, right? Like, I wish they'd just go off and cut off the rest of his junk. It says stuff like that. So I don't think we can just say like crash. That's why it never sat right with me, even growing up, on how we interpret that. Like, why even like we'll use that even as cussing, right? You can't cuss, you can't use certain words. Now you can say poop, feces, and crap, but you can't say the sh word because that's the bad one, right? So all that I always took issue with. So what you have to do is you have to go into the first century a little bit and see how they understood some of these things and what they meant. If you go into like especially the honor shame culture, that there was a group that was to be honored, a group that was to be shamed, and things like that. So all that good stuff. Now, real quick, he says, "Let there be no filthiness, nor foolish talk, nor crude joking." So when he's talking about this, he's not talking actually about what we would call the general jokes. he's referring to the honor shame dynamics, which is if you did something that was considered honorable, then you'd be honored. And if you did something shameful, you'd be shamed for it. And that can be actually a much broader thing than a lot of us would normally think. Like crass joking would be actually like joking about people's honor or even their lineage, because like, for example, when Jesus tells the Pharisees that they are a generation of vipers, that was extremely intense. And that was actually very dishonoring to them. He dishonored them. He did a diss track on on the Pharisees in front of them, and it shamed them in front of everyone. So that's why they walked away with great shame. So when it's talking about that, it's actually talking about like questioning people's honor. It's talking about questioning their dignity and like joking about that, not about just general jokes as a whole. So it's important that we understand that to them, crass jokes wasn't like a sex joke. To them, crass jokes was questioning people's honor, their where they're from, like how they grew up, stuff like that. So I hope that that helps. So all right. Okay. So I maybe that Osric, I hope that helps answer your question a little bit, but that's basically what it is. So go into the honor shame culture dynamic, and you'll notice that like when it's talking about crude joking, he's talking about that sort of thing. He's not talking about you know, our little sex jokes. So what is it? Would there be any resources that you'd recommend into looking into that more? Oh yes, there are. What I would definitely recommend you reading is David De Silva's book, Honor, Patronage, and Purity. Honor, patronage, and purity. I'm going to actually pull up Amazon here and I'll show it to you. I don't know. I don't remember if he deals with this particular topic, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. Because there's in the Bible, there's really like, it doesn't talk about no words. It's dealing with attitudes towards people and lineage, and a lot of that stuff kind of more comes about honor, patronage. So again, for those who are watching this in post, feel free to just fast forward this. Wow, why is it not pulling up? That is stupid. I literally bought mine on here like for Kindle a few months back. All right, I'm just going to do a quick share my screen with you guys because I'm going to recommend another resource here in a minute that it does pertain to our topic at hand. This book right here, Honor, Patronage, Kinship, and Purity, Unlocking New Testament Culture. This book right here is phenomenal. It would have saved me a lot of homework if I actually just started there with a lot of my studies. So this is just a good resource for literally everybody. Everyone should read this book. Everyone should understand the New Testament in the way that this presents it. It makes it so much cleaner and clearer. So I would definitely recommend doing that. And then once you do that, you'll start seeing that when he's talking about crude joking, he's not talking about that. Because again, Paul himself would not be an example of that, which would be weird because it's in writing and Paul's not stupid enough to do that. The other thing is I wanted to put in recommend this book, which is actually where I got a good chunk of my resources tonight. It's actually where I got the format of my of this tonight, and then I added my own things. But I would recommend everyone who wants to dig into the topic of progressive arguments for homosexuality deeper to get Preston Sprinkle's book on it right here. Does the Bible support same-sex marriage? 21 conversations from a historically Christian view. Tonight, I'm covering 24. I have 24 arguments that we will be addressing. So buckle up, Buttercup. So anyway, all right. Now I'm going to go ahead and jump in. I even have banners for you guys. So this is the first argument we will be addressing tonight. And like I said, I kind of follow Preston Sprinkle's books. I got a lot of notes from him and from my own notes of other studies I've done in the past. But I'm using his book as a template. So if you like what you hear here and you want to hear more, go get his book. Free promotion from Preston Sprinkle. Also, yes, if you're watching this and you notice there's a bunch of stuff in my church split sign right here, you might see all those little guys there. It's because my youth group decided to sabotage my office by putting little baby Jesuses literally everywhere, and the students begged me to keep this going on. So yeah. Anyhow, hold on one second. Hold on, gents. Speaking of my students, one of their vehicles just broke down, so I will be right back. They need a jump. Apologies, y'all. Luckily they're handy boys, so I just gave them my cards. God causes car to break down. God gives God glory. Yes, sorry guys. But they will be coming back up here with my keys. Like, well, we're so sorry. I'm like, it's perfectly fine. So all right, now we're gonna go ahead and get serious, but they will probably be busting in here in a minute. So there is that. In a few minutes, he just has to get a jump. So apologies, guys, no worries. So in fact, I'm just gonna tell him to leave my keys out there on the table. That's hilarious. So my keys at the welcome center. All right, cool. That way I can get this done. All right, so let's do this. So sex difference is described, not prescribed. That is what the progressives will say. So they go Genesis 1-2 highlights the sexual difference, but it doesn't actually require it. Of course, heterosexual relationships are what populate the earth and were necessary to bring the Messiah, but doesn't mean that they are the moral good of all sexual relationships. Most people are straight, but it doesn't mean that it has to be true for everyone. In other words, normal doesn't mean normative. After all, intersex people exist. So they kind of take this approach of like, well, it's described, not prescribed. It's not requiring it for literally everyone. However, it's true that Genesis 1-2 cannot be the only place where we might establish our Christian view of marriage, but it is not true that that's all that's going on here. It also is great to consider intersex individuals. I appreciate that about the argument. However, this idea of being descriptive and prescriptive, it's not, or prescriptive is not true. It is descriptive and prescriptive, okay? So it seems we can deduce that Genesis 1-2 both describes and prescribes sexual differences in marriage. In verse 223, Genesis 2:23, it merely describes them as male and female. That is true. But then in the next verse, in verse 24, it prescribes by saying, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and become one flesh with his wife. So it describes them, and then it prescribes what's going to happen after that. The author here isn't just describing marriage, but intentionally showing what marriage is at its core: sexual difference. In Genesis 2:23-24, it says, then the man said, this at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. He mentions her similarity there, and then he mentions her difference, that she shall be called woman because she was taken out of a man. And then it mentions their union. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. So he mentions the purpose of their union and relationship. So Jesus's teaching also should reflect on how this idea is understood. This idea of described, not prescribed. This needs to be understood. Jesus' teaching, he quotes Genesis 1-2 in Matthew 19, as I've quoted in previous videos regarding theology of the body. He answered, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So Jesus reveals a few things about this passage. One, that marriage is supposed to be permanent, that he calls the narrator the creator, not some ambiguous author or narrative device, which makes it prescriptive as it shows the intention of that creator. That is extremely important. Scholars agree also that the Bible teaches marriage is to be permanent, is prescriptive, while not the sexual act is in fact selective. It's the definition of cherry picking. So that is all that this is happening. And you're going to find that as I go through these arguments, that most of this is progressive cherry picking regarding all those things. So scholars agree, again, that the Bible teaches that marriage is permanent and that it talks about the sexual differences, but then suddenly they're like, oh, it's just descriptive, not prescriptive. That's not true, because that every time it describes it, it also prescribes what's going to happen in that marital union. So homosexual affirming theologians say this. So Karen Keene says, it's about loyal covenanted love, not sexual differentiation. That is the foundation of a biblical marriage. Matthew Vines, who's on the thumbnail of this video, says the Genesis text focuses only on what these two have in common: Adam and Eve's sameness, not their gender difference. However, this is to make an exception where the text doesn't specify such. It seems that the text has both covenantal love in mind, along with sexual difference in mind as it describes them. So you can't sit there and just say verse 23 is a thing while ignoring verse 24 and 25 and all these things that go after it. Instead, it's just to focus on the very front end of it. So Jesus pointed out three things, okay? He pointed out to their equality, that they become one flesh. He talks about the permanence, which is to hold fast to their wife in Matthew 19. And he also talks about their sexual difference, that they're male and female. So he uses Genesis at the very beginning as his foundation when answering this question. And of course, the people have brought up intersex individuals and use intersex individuals to deal with that he uses intersex individuals to justify homosexual activity. But this is also the same thing that they'll do when talk about abortion, the little cup game where they put a thing in it and they shuffle it around. I expect you to find it. It's like when we talk about abortion, you'll go, abortion is bad. And they go, what about the woman who's going to die if she doesn't get an abortion? They will point to this odd exception and then think that exception somehow justifies the whole. But that's not how we do logic. That's not how we do philosophy. And that's not good thinking, period. So you don't get to just appeal to this great mystery somewhere over here and then be like, oh, this one little group and this thing, this tension that exists, and then apply it to the whole. That doesn't work. And we need to call it out when it happens. See, I understand that that progressives are coming from a place where, that they're trying to affirm people's feelings, but the bottom line is I can't always affirm their feelings. We can't affirm people's feelings. And if you're a same-sex attracted person, know that you're not less of a person because you struggle with same-sex attraction. And it's not that you're a worse Christian because you might have same-sex attraction. The question is how are you going to respond to those attractions? Because we don't get to just justify our attractions and say all our attractions are equally valid, because they're simply not. So, all right, let's go ahead and move on and talk about intersex people a little bit. So the argument is that the progressives would argue that because Jesus affirms eunuchs in Matthew 19:12 and acknowledges some, thanks guys, appreciate it. You got it started? Is it started? Is it working? Oh yeah. Okay, cool. All right, yeah, you too guys, have a good night. I love those guys. Anyway, okay, so this is what you get when you do it after youth group. It's funny. I thought they all had cleared out, but I guess they were hanging out in the parking lot. All right. Anyway, the progressives argue that Jesus affirms the eunuchs in Matthew 19:12, right? He affirms them and acknowledges that some are indeed born that way. He must be referring to someone who is born with some sort of atypical sexual feature as part of their body. So since Jesus doesn't try to force them into male or female, we should follow Jesus's logic and not do the same thing to others, nor should we force them into a standard male and female dichotomy of sexuality. You see how weird that gets? Like, well, Jesus acknowledged them that they exist and they're neither one or like they don't fit this little thing. So why should we force out everyone? Why should we force everyone to be in this male-female dichotomy? Because they weren't born intersex. Like, homosexual people are not born intersex. So you are trying to apply that exception into the rule. So here's the thing about intersex people as well that nobody seems to talk about when they bring up this topic. This is an umbrella term that's used to describe at least 20 different medical conditions where a person is born with some atypical feature or deformity of their sexual organs. Okay, there's about 20 different deformities that can take place with intersex individuals. What they also don't tell you is the vast majority of the time, a lot of people have an intersex condition and they don't even know about it, because it can be something as simple as a chromosomal issue that they just didn't know, or a very small deformity that actually doesn't come off like any major issue at all, like enlarged things, if you will, if we could go with that. So this is an umbrella term. It's important to note that. And it's also important to note that those who are born intersex, about 99% of the time, that's the actual statistic, about 99% of the time are clearly male or female. Having such a condition doesn't make one not male or female. This is a false equivocation and a misunderstanding. Intersex is not evidence of a third sex or a non-binary sex, or that the sexes don't matter at all. It's either one or the other, or a large blend of both. In other words, male and female are the only sex categories, and humans only have two types of gametes, which is sperm and egg. So, Does Jesus's words affirm eunuchs and equate to same-sex marriage? So therefore it's descriptive, not, prescriptive and all that. Jesus uses the eunuchs as an example of singleness. Okay. That's the other thing that people seem to miss in that. Like, see, but Jesus affirms them right here. Yeah, he's talking about their singleness. They're not being married. He says that those in response to his disciples saying it's better not to marry. So his disciples are like, oh, it's better not to marry. And he's saying, hey, regarding this issue of singleness, and then this is his teaching on divorce. Jesus believes marriage is between a man and a woman. And we see that already. He doesn't make exceptions here. Even if this is talking about intersex people, which it probably is when he talks about eunuchs from birth. Notice he doesn't create a new category. He speaks this in conjunction with male and female to this intersex person, and that who doesn't fall outside of that. The text doesn't say that every single human will perfectly embody the ideal male or female physique. It just says that there are two categories. So the 99% of people who are born intersex, there's a very clear sex that they were intended to be born as, and they have a small deformity. And for that 1%, there's a blend that happens, but it's a blend clearly of male and female. And so you still only have the dichotomy that exists. And again, we shouldn't use the exception for the rule. And then, so the second argument that you oftentimes hear is one flesh does not imply sex difference. Yes, that is an argument. So they say this. The heart of this argument is focusing on the meaning behind the phrase of one flesh. That's what they do, and how it doesn't involve sexual difference. This argument proposes that one flesh isn't about sex, but about kinship. It's about them being together, right? So it's not about male body and a female body coming together in procreation, but about two people coming together in community and kinship. This argument is put forward by James Brownson, okay? And this is why I say people have laughed at me before and been like, what do you mean by this? There's a ton of pearl clutching in academia. Academia a lot of times can be a big joke, and I'm saying from someone who likes to engage in academia, some of it just makes me laugh because I'm like, you aren't serious, people. But anyway, and we're going to talk about just the major flaw in this argument right here. And some of you may have already spotted it. So like in many arguments, there is common ground, right? The word flesh, let's just throw them a bone for just a second. Just like Preston Sprinkle does this in his book, so I like to acknowledge it too. I think it's smart. The Hebrew word for flesh, which is basar, can often mean family or kin. That is true. Laban says this to his nephew Jacob, that you are my own flesh and blood, and with a host of other passages as well. So when they're like, oh, one flesh is talking about kinship, not about sex. That flesh can mean that, but we're going to talk about the difference, actually, the phraseology, and you may have already spotted it. The phrase also to cling to or to cleave, which is the Hebrew word dehak, it, as in to cling or cleave to your wife, doesn't refer to a sexual union, but rather to a kind of kinship. For example, it says that Ruth clung, she dehak to Naomi, her mother-in-law. But let's actually compare some of these things, like in Matthew 19 and Genesis 29 and all that. Notice, though, that the word flesh can mean kinship, but there is a stark difference in what comes before it mentioning flesh, because what the context is will dictate what it means by one flesh. Laban doesn't call Jacob one flesh. He calls him my own flesh and blood. So he doesn't call Jacob one flesh. He says, you are my own flesh and blood. One seems to indicate sex. The other one indicates kinship. There's a difference between flesh, which is used all over in the Bible to describe various things from one's body to food to kinship, and one flesh, which is the one used in regards to sexual relationships between male and female. And this is all throughout scripture. Genesis 2:24, Matthew 19:5-6, Mark 10:8, 1 Corinthians 6:16, Ephesians 5:31. So when all the places that talk about sexual union, it says one flesh, and all the parts when it talks about kinship, it says, you are flesh of my flesh, or, bone of my bone. What does someone like Brownson do with those passages? How does he address him in his writings? He doesn't. He doesn't even acknowledge the difference. He just pretends it doesn't even exist. So Jesus's entire statement regarding marriage is about sexual difference and the permanence of marriage, that divorce isn't God's will. Paul in Ephesians, the phrase one flesh also comes up in the Greek, by Paul in Ephesians 5:31. It says, therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And he's, of course, quoting Genesis 2:24. So Paul's theology is that one flesh implies loyalty between spouses and unity in sexual differences. This is why throughout the letter, especially chapter 5, he talks about marriage and discusses husbands as wives. He was a first century Jewish Pharisee. They outright rejected any sexual union not between a husband and wife, period. So yes, one flesh means kinship and a closeness between them and covenantal love and all that, but also meant sex, period. So Paul in Corinthians, Paul mentions the one flesh union where he corrected a man for sleeping with a prostitute. And notice the language he talks about when he's talking about this man who slept with a prostitute. 6:16. 1 Corinthians 6:16. Or do you not know that he was joined to a prostitute, becomes one body with her? For as it is written, the two shall become one flesh. So this is not a serious argument that one flesh does not imply sex difference. It absolutely does, and it's not referring to kinship. If one flesh meant kinship, as progressive arguments like to say, then that would seem odd, would it not? Because one does not have kinship with a prostitute, right? It's an exchange of goods, essentially. That's all it is. No one is leaving father and mother and cleaving to a prostitute in a brothel. Sex with a prostitute is a parody or mockery of marriage because they are acting as if they are married, but they are not. That is why he is talking about it and being offended by it and saying that Christians shouldn't do it. Because basically what you're doing when you're sleeping with a prostitute or having premarital sex at all is you're having the benefits of marriage without the commitment, dedication, and covenant of marriage. So anyway, so that's not a serious argument either, as I'm sure many of you can tell. The other argument is that no one actually believes in biblical marriage. So when you say this isn't biblical, they go, no, you. Okay, this is kind of their attempt at a reverse Uno card. And this is Megan DeFranza is a scholar that pushes this. It's basically that biblical marriages were heterosexual and patriarchal in the scriptures. So an adult man was the unquestionable authority in the home and was often married to a child or teenage girl with little education and even fewer legal rights. The Bible is filled with all kinds of marriages that no modern marriage should endorse. And then they use like these terrible passages that no progressive knows how to actually interpret because they don't take a historical view. Deuteronomy 21, men could marry women captured in war. Genesis 16, that men could take concubines and have them bear his children if his wife was infertile. Judges 21, that you could kidnap virgins and take them home as wives. 1 Kings 11, they can take as many wives as they can afford. Or Deuteronomy 22, where women were to marry the rapist. Many of these passages are straight up just misunderstood. They don't actually take the time to understand them. They just point it and go, Bible bad. That's all they do. But so it's good to be careful on how we throw phrases around like biblical marriage. So sure, okay, I'll throw you a bone on that. It's okay to acknowledge that maybe biblical marriage isn't the clearest way to do it. Maybe we should just say godly marriage, okay? Either way, what you're doing here is that you are confusing is versus ought. This is what I oftentimes call, when I talk to progressives and the deconstructors and all that, you have simply fallen into the is ought fallacy here. This confuses what is in the Bible versus what ought to be done, okay? Example 1, when they talk about the book of Judges, where this guy just takes all these virgin women and claims them as his wives. This entire book of Judges is actually meant to be a moral mess. That's the whole point of the book of Judges. It's not saying it's okay to kidnap virgins and make them your wives. It contrasts this as evil, and that in those days they had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit. So right? They all did what was right in their own eyes, as the very last verse says. The authors of the Bible aren't afraid to describe just how evil people can be. That's what's going on there. It's not saying that it's okay. It's just saying, yep, homeboy did this, okay? And if memory serves, he got a stake in the head by a woman named Jael. So it's not necessarily what we would call a golden image of this. So the Bible is filled with different genres, literary devices, descriptions, poetry, themes, all those things. It doesn't mean it's endorsing all of them. It literally is doing the opposite. So this is why I say some of these arguments, these just aren't serious people, okay? They're just not. Another example is that the Bible mentions Solomon's 700 wives, but you notice how it doesn't endorse it, nor did it command it. And actually, in fact, later on, it says that he failed as a king in 1 Kings 11. And also, he disobeyed scripture. Deuteronomy 17:17 said, and he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. Solomon disobeyed. So when reading your Bible, people need to ask that if it's descriptive or prescriptive. Is it describing things or is it telling me to do things? In other words, is this commanding something or is it merely describing events? We have commands in the Bible, like you shall not kill, steal, commit adultery. And we also see things just described, like Solomon having 700 wives. When Simeon and Levi found out that Shechem had raped their sister Dinah, or Dinah, however you say it, they went on a rampage, right? They went through and they destroyed a whole group of people. They looted their entire city. They went on a rampage. And the narrative actually doesn't say whether or not it was righteous justice or excessive violence. I mean, Genesis 49 kind of hints that it might be negative, but it was actually just the dad disapproving of it, really. It doesn't tell us what God thought about it, just tells you what happened. Another example is that a woman had to marry her rapist, as it was often claimed. Deuteronomy 22, if a man meets a virgin who is not betrothed, so I want to read this carefully, listen to the words. If a man meets a girl, a virgin who is not betrothed, and seizes her and lies with her, and they are found, then the man who lay with her shall give to the father of the young woman 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife. So he'll pay the dowry. Because he has violated her, he may not divorce her all his days. So it's like, see right there, he seized her, he did this thing. But this is what we call case law, first off. That is indicated by if. Whenever you see if, you need to understand that this is a case law. It means that if this happens, this is the result. If this happens, this is the result. It is not what we call an apodictic law, which is saying that you will or will not do something, okay? It's not. So we need to understand case law is a bit different. So let's quickly explain this, though, because people get this passage wrong all the time. I hear progressives use it all the time as a way to like attack the Bible. This passage is not talking about rape, okay? It's talking about seduction. The word translated rape in the Hebrew is tamas, okay? It doesn't mean to rape. When Tamar is raped in 2 Samuel 13, the word that is used is actually hazak. And hazak, which means to aggressively seize. So it's a violent act. In fact, a few verses earlier in Deuteronomy 22:25, we have an example of a rape. In this rape, when it's mentioned, the woman is let off because she's innocent, duh, and the man is put to death. So when there is rape in the Bible, a woman is never condemned for it. And the word to seize means he's talking about seducing her, okay? So here's a graphic idea of it. So just bear with me here. The Assyrians had a law, and if you go to the ancient world and compare the Torah to other ancient laws, you will see that the Torah is vastly an improvement. Because if a man raped a woman in Assyria, his wife would be raped in return, and then she'd be sold off as a concubine, as a second-class wife. And so the woman actually in Assyria took the brunt of the punishment, not the rapist himself. Laws regarding rape, seduction, premarital sex, and marriage in Deuteronomy 22 are all actually more humane than the contrary. So when people try to use this as a battering ram, this whole no one believes in biblical marriage, they actually don't understand that the biblical marriage, the marriage that's going on in the Bible, one, you're confusing with is versus ought, descriptive versus prescriptive, and then you're also completely misunderstanding the ancient world, and you're not doing proper Hebrew homework. Anyway, so the conclusion for this is obviously that with Jesus and Paul, there is something particularly distinct, especially in regards to human sexuality in Genesis 1 and 2. And it's the bedrock that they continually build upon as they on the rest of their theology. Deuteronomy 22 and other laws regarding divorce, sexual assault, all fall short of the image of God created man with originally. So the image God created man, male and female, which is to be married, to become one flesh, to create life and follow him. Period. Okay. So let's go to the fourth argument. Man, we're going to be here a while, boys. All right. Paul was not talking about consensual same-sex relationships. Oh, that's supposed to say relationships. Well, add an S at the bottom of my banner here, y'all. So this argument is wildly deceptive, by the way. It is jaw-droppingly deceptive. So the passage referring to same-sex relationships, so they're like, oh, these passages, the ones that are talking about it are not actually talking about consensual same-sex relationships like what we have today. They're talking about sexual exploitation, abuse, other non-consensual relationships, or extramarital relationships like rape, pederasty, prostitution, master versus slave dynamics, power dynamics, all those things. That's what it's really talking about. It's not talking about consensual same-sex relationships like we have today. And many of you who are watching this probably have heard this before. So this is the argument. If you go into, so real quick, actually, let me think about this for a minute. How do I want to respond? I get really fired up on this one. The reason why it's dangerous is because it's partially true, but it hides a major chunk of the data as well. And it is excruciatingly deceptive. And it actually upsets me when I hear it, because I'm like, you cherry picking individual who, and it's like either you cherry picked and you know better, or you listened to it and never thought to check someone's homework, which you should also know better. But anyway, if you go into the Roman and Greek literature, you will find the vast majority of same-sex relationships were masters having their way with their male slaves, and many other kinds of relationships where the person in higher standing would be performing the lewd acts upon someone else of a lower social status. That is true. Okay. You'll find that is very common in all of the literature. This is often older men with younger and, yes, teenage boys. This is also true. The fact of the matter is that many male, and I'm going to emphasize that, many male same-sex relationships often existed within power differentials. However, when Paul and others talked about male homosexual behavior, they often thought of abuse and exploitation, but they also would have thought of other things, which is why Paul was careful with his language, which we're about ready to address. So here's the main question. Are the biblical prohibition passages referring only to abusive kinds of same-sex relationships, or is it talking about them all wholesale? We need to look at a few things. We need to look at the language. We need to look at the background, and we need to look at ancient literature itself. So let's talk about the actual language of the prohibition. So if you have your Bibles with you, turn to Romans chapter 1, all right? So Romans chapter 1, verse 26 says this. For this reason, God gave them up to their dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women, were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving of themselves the due penalty of their error. So notice the language. Men and women use generic terms. He uses general terms, men and women, not men and boys, not any of the other language. And we'll talk about that later on in this video on how there's some very specific verbiage that would be used here for this, but that's for another argument later down the road. So in Greek literature, there were terms used to describe power differentials. So what we would call in a same-sex relationship between men, we might say that there's an active partner, if you will, erastes is what he would be called. And then there's the passive partner, which we call the victim, which we call eromenos, okay? So we have these two, you have the active and the passive. And in Greek, there were multiple terms to describe pederastic relationships of an older male with a younger male. So there is the pederastes, which is a love of boys. And then there is this one always gets me. Pedophorthros. It's like the PH and the TH get me, which is the corrupter of boys. Both are disgusting. And by the way, yes, your skin's going to crawl in this. There's some graphic stuff, but we have to talk about it because we're talking about what they meant back then. And yes, the Romans and the Greeks were known to be disgusting. All right. So Paul never uses any of these terms, though. He doesn't use pederastes, and he doesn't use pedophoros. He doesn't use these words. He uses the term, and he never even uses the term for master and slave, prostitute, or any other classes this argument attempts to make. So they're literally taking these other concepts, these other words, and shoehorning it into Paul's. They're colonizing Paul's words. They're not respecting his cultural background. If this isn't a cultural appropriation, I don't know what is. He's a Jewish first century Pharisee who is a Christian now, a follower of a Jewish Messiah. Respect their culture. You don't have to like it, progressives, but you can stop colonizing it. Okay. All right. Paul does not use these terms again. So Paul uses language of mutuality. He says, burned with lust for one another as a whole, committed shameful acts with what? Other men. He received in themselves the due penalty of their error. Paul seems to be referring to general same-sex relationships. And some assume Paul had no category for consensual same-sex relationships, which is why this argument even exists in the first place. This, however, is false, and there are many figures in history during this time where such things were recorded. For example, we're going to go down. We do actually have consensual same-sex relationships on record from the ancient world, but the progressives don't acknowledge this. We have, and I'm not even going to try. I will for your own entertainment. I'll try to say the name. I can't figure this one out. Asclepiades, Asclepiades, whatever. It's a woman. So it's a book about women, I should say. It references two women, Bido and Nanion, who engage in sexual relations with one another. In fact, we have many vases and other arts that depict same-sex relationships between women. Typically, during this time, heterosexual couples were depicted in such ways, or even pederastic couples. So, but we do have same-sex relations with women. We do have like pottery and stuff of that. We have Clement of Alexandria, right? So let's talk about Clement. He says that, so this was written around the same time as the New Testament was written. And Clement said, women behave like men in that women, contrary to nature, are given in marriage and marry other women. We have Ptolemy of Alexandria. He says he lived in this, by the way, this is a man who lived in the 2nd century, so a little after Jesus' time, and he was an astrologer, and he mentions how women would take other women as their lawful wives. And then we have Lamblikos, which is a 2nd century Syrian Neoplatonist. He wrote in a novel about an Egyptian queen who marries another woman. And then we have Lucian of Samosata, 2nd century rhetorician and satiricist, who describes two women, Megilla and Demonassa, as taking one another as a wife. So female same-sex consensual relationships and couples were an actual thing back in the time of Paul. So if this behavior was seen during Paul's day, and he's speaking broadly and generally, then this cannot be limited to just forced relationships on power dynamics. Okay, that doesn't get to exist. Also, we have male same-sex relationships also recorded back then. So they were a bit they were a bit different back then. Okay, so most of them existed in a sense of dominance, that you had social unequals like master and slave, and typically an active and passive role. However, this isn't exclusive. That tended to be the case, but that's not exclusive. These are examples of consensual relationships, such as same-sex youth, and are depicted as such. And 1/3 of all red figure vases actually show homoerotic behavior. They were very gay. 1/3 of the red figure vases show homoerotic behavior. Let that sink in. So there are also novels and other writings that depict male-on-male sexual relationships. And many might be like, well, that's fiction. That's fictional novels. But that's not how reality works. Like today, most of their writings are supposed to be a commentary on real life. So that just is a thing. So we have Xenophon of Ephesus. He lived in the 2nd century, and in his novel, An Ephesian Tale, he depicted a young man, Hippothos, is that how you say it? Hippothos, who falls in love with another young man of Hyperanthes. And the novel even mentions that no one suspected their romance together, which is indicating a form of shame within the culture. Then there's Achilles Tatius, which is a Greek writer and in the 2nd century, who wrote about a young man in a same-sex relationships around the same age. And then we have the Satyricon, a novel written in the 1st century, which appears to approve of same-sex relationships between males. So there is also a scholar named, again, as mentioned before, Laura Dunn, who wrote about this and pointed out that this was unique since at the time of the 1st century, the time that the New Testament takes place, most of these sexual relations between males were amongst unequals. In addition, it appears that during this time, the taboo of male and female sexual relations were waning, which would explain why Paul was addressing it as well in Romans 1. So these things exist. Okay, so we can't say that he's not talking about consensual same-sex relationships. No, we have plenty of evidence that that is not the case. And it seems like the taboo was, starting to go away during Paul's time, kind of like how we say in the early 2000s, the taboo was slowly going away. Okay. Therefore, also lies a major issue in breaking down this information. Okay. And this is something that progressives would not want to acknowledge, because progressives love to talk about power dynamics and they love to talk about elitism and privilege and all that. Well, guess what? The entire argument stands on the shoulders of elitism and privilege. And let me explain why. Most of what we know about the ancient world comes from the documentation that we've referenced here, that we've already looked at. However, all that documentation is by literate males, which is about 10% of the population, because they weren't just literate males, they had to be wealthy enough to be literate. So about 10% of the population. So therefore, everything that we have written by the elites of society is by the elites of society from the perspective of elites. This means that we're missing 90% of the perspective of the poor, destitute, and the other non-elites. In other words, the homosexual activity we have documented is likely a very small portion of what was actually going on, and it was probably worse. And as Preston Sprinkle aptly described in his book, and I thought this was great, it's like asking Donald Trump to tell us what life is like for an African-American single mom living in Alaska. No doubt Trump will have something to say. I'm just not sure it would be the most reliable description. It's exactly that. It's the exact same thing. All right. So in conclusion, Paul discusses same-sex marriage 3 times in his writings, and all times he condemns it, and he talks about male and female as a whole. He doesn't use any of the pederastic language or any of the power dynamic language that people like to talk about. So the other one that people say is, all right, Romans 1 is actually just condemning excessive love, not same-sex love. So this argument focuses on the reasons for the relationship, essentially, like what's your motive? So the last argument focused on the types of relationships. This one's focusing on like the motive behind it. Like other arguments that we've seen, this one tries to make distinctions between the ancient world's practice of same-sex relationships and consensual same-sex relationships that we have today. However, this argument proposes that Paul didn't have a problem with same-sex couples, but that he had an issue with excessive lust that led people to poor relationships, like master to slave. Okay, so this argument is actually another sneaky one and can be highly effective if one isn't prepared for it. There have been Christians who have argued for Christian marriage who have become frustrated because they hadn't heard this argument before. I've known Christians who have, I'm like, what? I never heard this. But even if this argument is true, and Paul is talking about excessive lust, that still doesn't get the LGBT like argument even off the ground, because other work would be needed to provide that conclusion. Because there's other passages. Okay, maybe you're right. Maybe Romans 1 is only talking about excessive lust, but you have the other passages you still have to deal with. So it doesn't actually get you there. But anyway, many writers in the ancient time believed same-sex relationships were the result of someone's excessive lust and not disciplining their desires over their bodies. So oddly enough, okay, even if I grant that, yeah, in context, the ancient world viewed same-sex relationships as basically lust out of control. Okay. Soranus, for example, 1st and 2nd century physician, said that a man's desire to be penetrated by another man does not arise naturally in humans. Rather, when modesty has been suppressed, it is lust that coerces to obscene usage body parts that have their own specific function, although there is no limit to desire. Dio Chrysostom said he says that those who seek such behavior, that they seek another greater and more illicit form of outrage once they had become in every way sated and full of their unrestrained pleasure with women. So basically it goes, they had their way with women and now their desire is out of control. Now they desire men. Plato said the pleasure enjoyed by males with males and females with females seems to be beyond nature, and the boldness of those who first engaged in this practice seems to have arisen out of an inability to control pleasure. So the ancient world might even agree with this argument, but it disagrees with it at the same time. Same-sex relations were looked at as excessive lust. Anyway, so the background literature is far more diverse than a lot of people claim, especially the progressives. So some in the ancient world said homosexual relationships were due to excessive lust, but also have evidence of the opposite in the ancient world. Plutarch believed that heterosexual relationships were due to excessive lust and that man-boy love was actually the purest kind of love. So Plutarch is disgusting. Okay. So he said this, and I quote, "There is only one genuine love, the love of boys, because heterosexual love was," and I quote, "so vigorous and powerful that it becomes torrential and almost out of control. It is a mistake to give the name love to it." Well, Plutarch doesn't understand how awesome sex is amongst men and women who are in marriage, because man, I hope you know what, for all you married folks out there, I hope your love is torrential and out of control. Yeah. All right. So reality is, like today, same-sex behavior was far too diverse to pigeonhole Paul. To pigeonhole Paul is just saying that this was referring to just a singular part of it. Okay. Romans 1:26-27 says that the women exchanged natural relations for those who are contrary in nature, and the men likewise gave it up. So Paul speaks negatively about women in same-sex relationships and then draws a parallel, says likewise, so did men. Yeah, he's talking about this wholesale. All right. So again, let's talk about the language here. Paul uses words to describe this lascivious desire and behavior amongst people, and progressive use this term even to build their own argument, which is kind of funny. You have epithumia, which can be positive or negative, and we see this in 124. In this context, it appears to be negative. We have pathos, which is emotion, which can be positive or negative. Or there's orexis, which is lust, strong sexual desire, okay? A sexual passion. This word is used oftentimes negatively and is used negatively here. But none of these words bolster the excessive lust argument. That's not even here. These words are not wrong in Paul's letter because of excessive lust, but because of the action that goes with it. Same-sex relations is considered to be contrary to nature, okay? This is why theology of the body discusses that a man's body and a woman's body make no sense on their own, that you need to bring the two together to make them make sense. Then also we have this one, that the biblical authors didn't know about sexual orientation. They didn't know that like someone was born gay, all right? That's the argument. So the writers of the Bible had no idea that some were naturally innately born to be attracted to the same sex. So the argument far overstates its case, okay? Like, as is the case for like these progressive arguments. This is when you know you live in a postmodern world where people don't care about facts. Anyway, as we have already examined, there were people who were in same-sex relationships preferentially. In addition, there were ancient writers who stated that people seemed innately attracted in the same sex. Aristotle, he said that same-sex desires can come from habits, but all others appear to occur by nature. Parmenides said that the passive male partner must have been generated in the act of conception. Serranus said that he believed that homoerotic behavior didn't come from nature, but it didn't come from nurture, but from nature. And he was alive, by the way, at the same time as Paul. So all these people describe sexual behavior as a byproduct of innate desire. And so and Dr. Bernadette Bruton concludes that contrary to the view that the idea of sexual orientation did not develop until the 19th century, the astrological sources demonstrate the existence in the Roman world of the concept of a lifelong erotic orientation. Many scholars also agree with her. And so this is the reality. Many people who try to redefine the Bible to make it more palatable to modern sensibilities end up ignoring true history, and scholars are continually ignored in favor of narrative. And there are other scholars who ignore evidence for the same purpose. The issue with this argument is that it imposes modern ethical reasoning onto ancient Near Eastern biblical authors. Again, it colonizes the text in a way that it's a form of cultural appropriation and definitely revisionist history. So anyway, then we have the seventh argument that people will use, which is Romans 1:26 isn't referring to female same-sex relationships, sexual relationships. And you get the idea already here. That's similar to the last one. Hold on, I need a drink. All right. And by the way, heads up, this argument is more technical, and you're going to mostly find this in the ivory towers of academia, but whatever. Here's the argument that Romans 1:26, when talking about women relations with their when talking about women relations with other women, it isn't talking about lesbian behavior, but rather women engaged in a non-procreative sex with men, like oral or, the back door, if you will. They say that this is how the most early church fathers interpreted this, and the phrase against nature, which is paraphysin, was commonly used to describe such things, such as oral or, again, the back door. In addition, the word used in 126, which is exchange their natural use for what is against nature, is about that. So anyway, so this argument is probably onto something to one degree or other, but it sort of misses the forest for the trees. Okay, like this is what's funny. It's like every time you're like, kinda, but no. The same-sex angle still makes more sense and actually dovetails with the non-procreative sex view. That's what's funny. Like, no, it's talking about other sexual acts that are not procreative. That's what it's referring to. It's like, yeah, but you realize that goes towards same-sex relationships, right? Because they're not procreative. Anyway, so the phrase against nature, the paraphysin, almost always refers to same-sex unions as well. So it doesn't actually work. It's not talking about like oral sex and stuff. So even writers who condemn non-procreative heterosexual sex don't use that phrase in any of the writings. So rather, this phrase is used as an umbrella term for all same-sex sexual activity that they gave up their natural use. Because again, we talked about in the last video, but procreation is part of it. So the phrase likewise in 127 suggests that in 126, that it's talking about female same-sex relationships. Everyone agrees that 127 is talking about male-to-male activities. Thus, to lead the verse with likewise would connect the same theme from 126 to 127. You know what I'm saying here? Like, you can't sit there and be like, oh, well, it's really talking about this with women, like non-procreative sex. And then he's like, well, likewise, men. And then be like, well, no, with women, it's just talking about oral and the back door. With men, it's talking about same sex. What? Like, no, he says, and likewise. He's referring to the same thing. They're not two different ideas. They are connected, hence likewise. Using the term natural relations, which, Physicane, was it Crayson? Is that how you say it? Suggests that both verses are talking about same-sex relationships. If natural relations in one verse means same-sex relations, then it makes sense that it would mean the same thing in both verses, especially when they're so close to one another. So lastly, it makes no sense that Paul would only rebuke women for having non-procreative sex with men, like, backdoor or oral, without her mentioning the man involved. Paul was an equal opportunity rebuker. He wouldn't just be like, women, you shouldn't do that, and not mention the men. Because we see him do that. He calls men and women out all the time on their sexual behavior. Hey, I hear son-in-laws with a mother-in-law. That should not be. That's messed up. That's disgusting. Stop it. Right? He calls them both out. He's an equal opportunity offender. And he only calls the women out. And the women, as we all know, back then didn't have nearly as much power compared to the men. So don't you think he'd rebuke the men just like he does in 1 Corinthians 7 when he's like, men and women, you have equal claim to each other's bodies. So again, doesn't mention them here. So this non-procreative view wants to say that Paul was rebuking women for having non-procreative sex, but the reality is that it tends to be men who pressure women into these acts in the first place. Thus, it makes no sense to rebuke only the women and not men. Okay, Paul was smart, and we already have evidence that he rebuked men and women for their sexual behavior. So other scholars say that in Paul's world, the word kresis always describes male to female penetrative sex, not female to female. Thus, the verse in 126 cannot be referring to female sex since there is no penetrator. Is Paul worrying about himself with these sorts of details? Like, are we like, this is where we just start getting pedantic to just try to find any loophole possible. But the word's meaning is defined by how it is used, right? And in what context. How it is used elsewhere is important, yes, but what really matters is how it's being used right here, right now, in that particular passage, okay? Paul is using the word to describe same-sex sex. This interpretation doesn't make sense of both verses as a whole. So we do have ancient resources that describe women as taking the role of a man in sex, but that's not all what it's referring to. For example, Seneca says, having devised so deviant a type of shamelessness, these women enter men. Really messed up. By the way, don't listen to this round, young company. I probably should have just started with that disclaimer, not an hour into this, but you've been warned now. Anyhow, Paul is likely using a term often used to describe sex as a whole, often associated with heterosexual sex, to make his point that they're having sexual relations with each other. It makes more sense that way. It's far more natural than him being like, I have this one particular view and only going to address women. Doesn't make sense. However, one reason God forbids homosexuality also is because it violates the marriage and reproductive union between male and female. So again, even as talking about this, congratulations, you played yourself, because now is the reverse Uno card still on yourself. All right. This one, you may have heard of this one. This one was very popular on TikTok a few years ago. I heard it all the time. And that is that the word homosexual was actually added to the Bible in 1946. There's actually a documentary that they're working on, and I'm not sure if it's out yet, just called 1946. And the argument basically is this: that the word homosexual is an incorrect translation of the word arsenokoites and malakoi. You can actually go look up the trailer for this documentary if you want. It's on YouTube. And you can see how the argument is lauded there. And basically, it's that we don't see this show up. So you have in 1 Corinthians 6:9, or do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived, neither sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor men, malakoi, who practice homosexuality, arsenokoites. And we also see the same thing in 1 Timothy 1:9-10, says that those who practice homosexuality, which is arsenokoites, enslavers, liars, all these people are contrary to sound doctrine. Okay. So what makes this argument effective is that it's mostly true, but it doesn't get them where they think it is, but it's mostly true. Homosexual doesn't actually appear in translations until 1946. Because they didn't use that term. They use other terms for the act. So again, this is having your elitism and your privilege and your modern worldview and like force onto the text. But because homosexuality today really refers to people who are only attracted to the same sex. So sure, maybe the word's not the best way to describe what's what everyone thinks about when they're thinking of this, like, okay, of this sort of relationship. So you could throw them a bone on that, I guess, where it's like, yeah, okay, so when we think homosexual, we think like same-sex relationships and all this, and it didn't include all the other things. Okay, but that doesn't really get you there. It still means only part. It's still same-sex relationships. Okay, that's the point. The difference is subtle, but it's important though, that the word word here would make actually men who actively have sex with males, which is all men, males as a whole, older, younger, doesn't matter. It covers the entire biological sex. So there are Christians who are attracted to the same sex, right, in their view. So there are Christians who are attracted to the same sex who choose to actually also remain celibate as well, not engaging in sexual activity in devotion to Jesus. So there are other people who experience same-sex attraction who, though, through prayer and much commitment to becoming like Christ, eventually have their attraction slowly shift to eventually feeling more comfortable in heterosexual straight relationships. So okay, we could acknowledge that exists, right? Yep. So let's just make sure we throw that out there. Okay, some people are celibate due to their same-sex relationship, their same-sex attraction. They realize that they shouldn't act out on that in devotion to Jesus. And other people, through devotion to Jesus and through repentance and all the things, they actually lose their same-sex attraction or actually become more attracted to the opposite sex. However, just because there's technically a right term, like homosexual might not be the best term for arsenokoites, it doesn't mean that it allows for same-sex relationships suddenly, because he actually condenses it with male to male as a whole, okay? Entirely. He's talking about the entire sex category of male. So the Apostle Paul is the first person to use the term arsenokoites that we can see. Many progressives will point this out. That's a new term to conservative Christians, and so we just misunderstand it. This, however, is false. He is not the first person to only use this sort of verbiage, okay? He might be the first one to kind of describe it in this sense, but the word or a similar word is used in Leviticus. We're going to look at that. So arsen means male, okay? And then koite means bed. So arsenokoitos means male bed. Men in bed with one another, okay? It's very simple. So together they essentially mean man who goes to bed with a man who goes to bed with a male, or one who has sex with a male, okay? So these two separate words actually appear in the Septuagint, the arsen and the koite. For example, Leviticus 18:22 says, "You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination," which in Greek is kai meta arsenos, and then it goes on to koiten. Okay, so we have arsenos and koiten right there in Leviticus 18:22, and what we see is that Paul just took that arsenokoites and he combined it. Okay, very simple. Leviticus 20:13, "And whoever lies with a male and as one lies with a woman," he goes on, is meta arseno koiten. This is in the Septuagint. So we just see that Paul, being a proper Hellenistic Pharisaic Jew, would know his Septuagint, and we see this as combine the terms. It's not that big of a deal. All right, very similar, very obvious. So anyway, the Septuagint was written before Paul's time, so Paul didn't just invent this kind of language. And the disciples used it. So it appears that Paul uses actually Leviticus 20:13 to build out a compound word to describe what he's seeing in front of him. That's far simpler of an explanation than, well, that's not what the word really means, and it's talking not same-sex relationships of being consensual. That's like, what? No, this is far clearer. That what would a first century Jew be more likely to do? Come on. All right. Even though homosexual isn't the best translation for it, the word is still referring to same-sex relationships. So in fact, it's a stronger and broader word than homosexual. So homosexual might be someone who's just attracted to same-sex people, but the word that's used, you're like, oh, that's mistranslation. Okay, great. Anyone who has sexual relationships with the same sex. Not just people who are in a loving, committed relationship, but all of them, wholesale, including those. It's a broader term. So it doesn't actually help their case. It hurts their case. So again, and not all translations use the word homosexual either. Like King James says, abusers of themselves with mankind. NIV from 1984 says homosexual offenders. CSB says males who have sex with males. And I think that one's probably the better translation, males who have sex with males. But anyway. Okay, moving on. Argument number 9. Like I said, guys, I am just trying to truck along. I will get to the live chat at the end, so save your questions and super chats for then, because I don't even have that pulled up for me to have these banners for me to keep track. Anyway, okay. So the argument goes like this. The biblical times were sexist, racist, homophobic, and patriarchal. They mistakenly believed that men were the supreme beings and that everyone else was had to be heterosexual. So they viewed anything outside of these parameters as perversions. So they were homophobic and sexist. That's the real problem here. The more academic view would be that the biblical authors were slowly moving away from their toxic culture and becoming more like Christ, where patriarchy dissipated and homophobia disappeared. The primary issue here isn't same-sex acts, but treating a lower status man as if you were a lower status woman. That's what they're trying to say. Okay. So, of course, the Bible is written, and this is true, the Bible is written in a different cultural context. And so, yes, we need to make adjustments, all that stuff. Okay. I'll acknowledge that. But here's the thing. There are two key things that we need to look at when we're looking at the Bible: the historical cultural context and the biblical text itself. Dr. James Brown says this: the dominant penetrating male was always older versus younger, free versus slave, or higher status versus lower status. However, if this was always true, then one might assume Paul believed this way. But what we saw earlier, as mentioned, as I gave examples, there were many examples of this not being true. This isn't the only one types of same-sex relationships that existed. There were diverse amounts of sexual relationships back in the ancient Rome. In fact, Pompeii, there was a lot of art showing diverse sexual lifestyles, from men playing passive roles with women even, and women outright rejecting passive roles as a whole, men having sex with men, and all sorts of stuff. So we also see that Emperor Nero himself actually took the passive role when he married a man. So the reality is, traditional sexual norms were entirely crumbling during the first century. And so Paul was probably speaking about it, okay, speaking directly to it and speaking of it. So this progressive argument assumes a lot and ignores other parts of culture and other contexts in order to even try to make its point. But even if let's say for the sake of argument, this is true, okay? People making these arguments believe same-sex relationships were always older, younger, slave power dynamics and all that stuff. And as mentioned before, this isn't true, but let's just say it is true for the sake of argument. The progressive argument would only work if Romans 1:26 was not dealing with same-sex female relationships as well. Because in addition, there is nothing in the text indicating sexism. In fact, quite the opposite. Paul elevates women more so than other ancient writers because he does believe in the work of Jesus Christ. Hence his what he said about Junia, what he said about Lydia. Paul in Romans 1:26-27 references Genesis 1-3, which means he finds the entire thing a violation of the created order. Genesis 1:26-27 says, actually shows how men and women are equal and fully created in the image of God, both given the same moral callings. So we have created order, not sexism. That appears to be Paul's motivator here. Because Paul is careful to choose words that mean male and female as a whole, okay? Not just men or boys or women and slaves, anything like that. He reduces the entire acts down to male or female. So he doesn't reference all the other categories that exist. He said all men, all women, male and female, okay? Paul was countercultural and he lost his head because of it, okay? We need to remember this. He died for the faith, and when he died, he was talking about the gospel of Jesus Christ and what it did. He reduces the entire act again down to these things. He's countercultural. We can't force Greek or Roman values onto Paul either. That's absurd. So he was countercultural. He lost his head for it. And Paul elevates women all throughout his letter. So you can't say it's because of a sexist culture, right? He said women were his co-workers. They were workers in the Lord. They were deacons. They were prophets. They were his patron, the apostles. There's an apostle. So no male or female as well. They have equal authority over their husbands' bodies in 1 Corinthians 7. And Paul calls husbands and wives to submit to one another in Ephesians 5. So in Paul's day, it was quite popular to be misogynistic. It was very popular to be very demeaning toward women. And instead, he elevates women constantly. In fact, Aristotle says the relation of a male to a female is by nature a relation of superior to inferior and ruler to ruled. Okay? Very popular back then to think this way. But Paul only tells women to submit to their husband. Paul not only tells women to submit to their husbands, but Paul also calls husbands to submit to their wives, and for all believers to submit to one another. So Paul never says women are inferior to men. So this argument doesn't get off the ground. You can't say it's because of a racist, sexist, bigoted, homophobic culture. He's talking about same-sex relations. Stop taking your modern day issues and shoving it onto the text. Okay, thank you. And you guys may have heard this one before. Jesus never mentions homosexuality. Oh, if it's such a big deal, then why does Jesus not mention it? Jesus was silent on this matter. So therefore, it must not be that big of a deal, right? Wrong. So, yeah, sure, Jesus never mentioned it, but we only have 3.5 years recorded in 4 gospels of his teaching. So first off, there's that. Secondly, Jesus was a Jewish rabbi. And there was hardly any reason for Jesus to ever clarify his position on same-sex relationships, because every single rabbi ever in the history of ever in the ancient world all agreed on this. So you go back 500 years before Jesus and 500 years after Jesus, and you'll find every Jewish rabbi and every church father all agreed same-sex relationships were prohibited. So to have such widespread agreement in Judaism on any topic is actually quite remarkable because, for example, some Jews love the temple. Some believe the temple was corrupt. Some Jews believe the entire Tanakh was the inspired word of God. Others believe just the Torah. Then some Jews believed in just soul sleep. Others didn't believe that there was a resurrection or an afterlife whatsoever. So pretty remarkable that they all agree on this. So Jesus was ministering to Israel, to Jewish people. And throughout his entire earthly ministry, Jesus continually dealt with debated issues within Judaism. So, and he never weighed in on this. Why? Because it wasn't debated in Judaism. It was accepted wholesale. However, Jesus wasn't silent, though, on the central question of the debate, which is the sexual difference between the two. Again, Matthew 19 and Mark 10, he talks about the creator and the creation, male and female, that they shall leave father and mother, the two shall become one flesh. So he talks about marriage being a man and a woman. So even though he doesn't talk about homosexuality, he sure seems to describe and prescribe a godly marriage between male and female. So the question on same-sex marriage is really about the nature of marriage. And so Jesus condemned all sexual immorality as defined by the Jewish works of his time as well, and the word porneia. So he affirmed all those things, that's what sexual immorality was, and he was in alignment with other Jewish teachings. So in the first century Judaism, the time of Christ, porneia was all forms of sex outside of male and female marriage. So when he says lust or sexual morality, that's the word porneia, and porneia always meant all sexual relationships outside of a male and female marriage. That's what it meant in the Jewish culture. Okay. Now, and it's important to note that there are actually diverse views within sexual ethics in Judaism, right? You have the school of Hillel, which was very lenient on divorce. And you have the school of Shammai, which is stricter on divorce. And Jesus agreed with Shammai. He was stricter. So since Jesus always sided with the sexually stricter ethics, doesn't it make sense that he would also be sexually stricter when it comes to the same-sex relationships that were the thing of his like the rabbinic teachings and Jewish culture of the time? Again, stop trying to colonize the Bible and first century Jews. Stop doing that. Don't be an anti-Semite, okay? So to love is never to give permission either. So we'll be like, well, we're to love. Yeah, he says he loves us. Yes, and he says we're to love one another. But that's never to give permission to just act out however you want. The way your love is supposed to be defined and the way you're supposed to act in love is the way we have it exemplified by God and what he has told us love is. So finally, all right, let's go to argument number 11. It's better to marry than to burn. Paul says it's better to marry than to burn with sexual desires. So it's better to marry even if it's the same sex, if of the same sex, than to burn with passion and commit further sin. So it's harmful to force them to live in sexually celibate lives because Paul says we should marry. That means that homosexual people should marry the same sex. So they're trying to make a pragmatic argument essentially from here. And this is from 1 Corinthians 7. But so let's talk about this. So between puberty and marriage, there can be many years of unmet sexual desires. Okay. Let's be honest here. Puberty, you had a lot of unmet sexual desires, and even some marriages, there could be unmet sexual desires and overwhelming sexual frustration in life as a whole. This is true. Many of us can probably even resonate with the aspect of life of being sexually frustrated, and it isn't a pleasant experience. So we can probably look at this and go, yeah, I get it. You don't want to burn. However, this objection deserves some love and care. Okay, if you're talking to somebody about it. I know I'm on my live stream. I'm just having my normal, like, callous attitude that I have a tendency to have in my videos. I don't mean to have that, but when I do talk to people, I'll have you know, when I talk to people, not just a camera, where I'm just having to entertain myself while talking to a camera, I am a bit more gentle. Okay, I promise. All right. So it's important to read the entire passage of 1 Corinthians 7. It addresses a lot of issues regarding Christian sexuality. However, the command was to the unmarried and to the widows. He says to the unmarried, the agamos, and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single, as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Paul is giving advice to the unmarried and the widows. It could also mean men who were once married, since it's paired with widow. Okay. So later in the same chapter, verses 25 to 38, Paul addresses those who have even never been married before. He deals with parthenos, which are virgins. Okay. The Greek phrase cannot says that they cannot control themselves is in the present tense, and it is better translated as they are not controlling themselves. So in other words, they're getting it on right now. They're not controlling themselves at all. Paul is talking about people who are already having sex in this passage. Okay. This is revealing for a multitude of reasons. Paul isn't saying that if you have a high sex drive, you don't have the gift of singleness, whatever that means, because you clearly don't have self-control. This is false. Self-control is, after all, a fruit of the Spirit. Go to Galatians 6, okay? Oh, no, 5. Galatians 5. So in the Bible, the gift of singleness is actually the state of existing as single. Okay. So when you're single, that's considered a gift. When you're married, that's considered a gift. It's not some ethereal spiritual gift that some people have that one person is called to and another person is not. That's not how this works. The idea of a soulmate isn't even biblical. Okay. So that God has, some special person out there for you in the ether. Okay. That's not in the Bible. So whatever state we find ourselves is a gift from God, and he will give us the strength, grace, and courage to live in it. So again, this passage is about a concession, not an accommodation. Concession, when two things are both morally permissible, but one is better than the other. So, and then we have the accommodation, when something truly is sinful, but for whatever reason, it allows for the sin to take place to prevent further sin. So we have a concession. The two are both morally permissible, but one is better than the other. And then we have an accommodation, which is, this is sinful, but for whatever reason, it allows for the sin to take place to prevent further sin. And this is where you get the case laws. If this happens, then this. Like, we're making an accommodation here. We didn't want it, but we're going to have to make an accommodation. And the concession is when two things are perfectly fine, but this one is more desirable. Okay. Paul makes a concession between a good vocation, marriage, and a better vocation, singleness, in order to avoid sexual immorality in porneia. So Paul was a Jewish Pharisee. I keep mentioning that, but it's important to mention over and over again, which means sexual immorality was any sexual relationship outside of male and female marriage. And that was anything outside of that was forbidden. Using Paul's logic to say homosexuality ought to be permitted goes against Paul's entire point here. That no, you are to control yourself. That is better to be single. Okay. So as a first century Jew, sexual difference was essential for marriage, as mentioned before. So in order to believe this permits same-sex relationships, we would have to find a way to prove that Paul affirmed such a union and then apply his affirmation of that into this passage. Paul does not always make concessions toward one's sexual passions. In fact, usually he does the opposite, right? That's the other thing. Like, he doesn't make concessions toward your sexual desires. He actually usually does the opposite. He forbids it. The man sleeping with his stepmother. Paul doesn't say, hey, you two are clearly burning for one another, so you should get married. He doesn't do that. He says, no, I forbid it. And he applies it to the law of Leviticus 18. So some ask, what about polyamorous people? Those who believe their sexual desires can't be satisfied with one person. I hear this often from, like, I even had family members use this who, like, well, marriage isn't for everybody. Some people, they want this. But the same logic would apply. One man, one woman, and one marriage. That's why God had things intended to be. Control yourself. Have some discipline. You're not an animal. You're an image bearer of God. You're a human being, and you don't need to be spreading your seed or receiving seed all over the world. Okay? It's gross. Be with one person. Have some dignity. If one is already married to multiple people due to their culture, let's say someone becomes a believer, you're over somewhere in Africa or Asia and they have multiple wives, or in the Middle East, they should remain probably with those who they've already made commitments to, because there's right dependability there. I get that. But they will never be able to move into things like complete spiritual leadership, because 1 Timothy 3 says that those people should be one women men, right? So anyway. Woo! All right. Number 12. Man, we're going to get through this, guys. I promise. There's a ton of arguments, but we got it all down and we're going to respond to all of them. But my office is hot. Wow. Anyway, this argument is using Jesus's Sabbath hermeneutic, his interpretation here, which is that human need is always taken into account by Jesus, and that human need overrules the rigidity of the law. And by the way, if that sounds scary, that's because it should. The law says that there should be no work on the Sabbath, but Jesus overrules this when people are in need. It's okay to follow the higher law of love your neighbor in favor of the lower law, which is honor the Sabbath. So they take the Sabbath conversation, apply it to sexuality. Imagine how desperate you have to be to make that argument. But anyway, so just because Jesus seems to make exceptions when it comes to divorce, due to the hardness of hearts and things like that, protecting people from abusive relationships, or Sabbath keeping, protecting mankind from complacency toward one another on the Sabbath, doesn't mean that Jesus would do the same for sexual relationships. So you're making a category error, for one. There are things the Bible shows some leniency on, although it doesn't reflect God's will, right? Like divorce, we have examples of that. Sabbath keeping, we have examples of that. Just because one command in Scripture is given some amount of exception doesn't mean other commands are. And the reason why he healed people on the Sabbath and broke the Sabbath was to heal people of actual problems. So he literally put other people's needs before the Sabbath keeping. In other words, he didn't want to forget the sanctity of their life in favor of the Sabbath. Mankind was made for the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Okay, that's his whole argument there. Point is to make sure you're getting your rest and you're taking your time devoted to God. But if somebody needs you, they need it. You don't need to have sex. You don't need to have sexual relations. You don't need to have your sexual desires fulfilled. And some of you guys need to hear that probably more often than that. And I need to hear that. Everyone needs to hear it. You don't need to have your sexual desires fulfilled. Okay. Just because one command in Scripture is given some exceptions, again, doesn't mean that all the commands are. Clearly, there is a hierarchy of expectations regarding certain laws. The burden of proof actually is to anyone who uses this argument is actually on them to demonstrate that Jesus also had same-sex relationships in mind. Otherwise, this can be just simply dismissed as stretching, which it is. And here's the biggest concern. The argument runs into a risk of idolizing marriage and sex. Because it's saying that a person's health need is the same level as needing their sexual things fulfilled. So from a pastoral vantage point, this is what Preston says in his book. From a pastoral vantage point, Keene raises an important point about how realistic it is for Christians in the 21st century to live without having sex with the person they desire. She points out that evangelicals between ages 18 and 29 show rates of non-marital sex at 44 to 80%, and that people will have sex either within marriage or outside of it. So Keynes is being realistic here, of course, but Christians will live perfectly. But as an ethical argument, we shouldn't find it compelling. We shouldn't determine whether something is morally good based on the percentage of self-proclaimed Christians who aren't observing it. Okay, so what? Christians aren't good at controlling their sexual desires. That's been going on since the very beginning. Doesn't suddenly mean that you start making exceptions for it. It's not like, oh, you know what? You're having a hard time controlling that. Go ahead. Have a good time. Yeah. Okay, cool. Christians are hypocrites. We all know this. That's why we need Jesus. That's why we pursue him. That's why we repent and live a way that transforms us into the image of Christ. That's why we go through all that. Okay. So even Christians, many Christians seem to buy the lie that we need to have sex. Christians assume that marriage is a necessity for human flourishing, that the church has come unintentionally or sometimes intentionally or unintentionally adopting the same worldview that sex and marriage is what's going to make one happy. That's not the case, okay? The gospel never promises that you will have a spouse or have sex or feel sexual gratification at all. Gospel's not about that in any way. So in fact, the gospel actually calls us to deny our flesh more than it tells us to give into our flesh and to store treasures in heaven, not here on earth. So that's why if you have someone who is living celibate because they have same-sex attraction, we shouldn't put them down for that. We should actually, in fact, praise them for it, because that is actually an extremely difficult thing to do. Sorry, I lost my place real quick, so I'm going back to it. All right, there we go. So anyway, that we should praise them for it, because so the argument also seems to believe that God created marriage to solve, the lonely problem purely for sexual gratification and companionship. But marriage isn't the sole solution to being lonely. It's just not. It's part of that solution, but so is the church. So is your fellowship with other believers. Ultimately, our fellowship with God is what's supposed to bring fulfillment. So humans can live without sex, but we can't live without love and intimacy. Until we, the church, understand the differences between, sex and love and intimacy, we will continue to fail our same-sex attracted friends, and we'll also continue to fail to our single young people. We need to make sure we keep that in mind as we go forward. No one should live without love and intimacy. Love and intimacy are not limited to romantic sexual relationships, though. So we shouldn't buy the world's lie on that. So then we get to the 13th argument, that God's acceptance of Gentiles mirrors how we should accept the LGBT community. If this sounds like stretching, it's because it is. Anyway, all throughout the New Testament, Gentiles are now included. They were the outside people, and now they're being welcomed in, despite dietary laws of circumcision and all those things. So therefore, we should accept the LGBTQ people in. And this is what we call the Marcion heresy. But anyway, the dietary, that we get to throw it all away. So because they're like, oh, they got rid of the dietary laws and stuff. But it's important to note that the dietary law was later implemented by the law of Moses, right, in Leviticus, and circumcision was introduced by Abraham in Genesis 17. So it hasn't actually always been a requirement anyway, but I feel like I need to get that off my chest. But this argument is passionate about welcoming people. I get that. However, it doesn't mean that you give up holiness or God's will in order to be accommodating. So those making this argument appeal to Acts chapter 15, right? That we should welcome these people, just to make sure that they don't commit idolatry, that they shouldn't consume blood, and that they shouldn't be given to sexual immorality, which is porneia. But notice what is brought up there? Sexual immorality, porneia. And what I mentioned before, what do Jewish people use that term for? All sexual relationships that are outside of male to female marriage. So this doesn't look actually good for them to appeal to this text, and this text is actually using a word that goes against their position. Same-sex relationships were considered porneia. They were considered sexual immorality. So these rules in Acts 15 are not arbitrary. They come from Leviticus and other places and it requires Gentiles to live in the land of Israel. So apostles weren't contradicting the law to make exceptions to the Gentiles. In fact, they were following the law and welcoming Gentiles as they should. Many who make this argument for same-sex relationships ignore the connection in Leviticus 17 to 18. They just pretend like that doesn't, like he's not referencing that at all in this. So anyway. All right, 14, slavery and women in the modern era justify same-sex relationships. So the argument goes like this, that slavery never outright condemn, the Bible never outright condemns that practice of slavery, but we see the normality of slavery being challenged. The Bible never outright condemns oppression of women or extreme forms of patriarchy found in the Middle East, but it certainly begins a push for the equality of women throughout. Likewise, we ought to progress the same way with same-sex relationships. So because there's signs of this happening in other places in the Bible, in these other categories, we should apply that same logic over here. Of course, again, the evidence is on you to show that that's even a thing, that you can even apply those things as if they're the same. But whenever the Bible mentions same-sex relationships, they are forbidden. That's just the reality. There is no push forward. So why should we have push forward? Why should we ignore all that? If we see a push forward with how women are treated and slaves are treated and all that, we see that needle moving, but not homosexuality, then it should tell us homosexuality is not a needle that we need to move. Again, you have to make the argument to show me how the needle has moved to show that we ought to work toward that direction. So in fact, the Bible actually does, so by the way, Leviticus 18:22, Leviticus 20:13, the Romans 1:26-27, 1 Corinthians 6:9, and 1 Timothy 1:9-10 are all places that talk about homosexuality, and they're always condemned. But the Bible does have a changing of sexual ethnic trajectory, and is actually to a greater strictness, not looser. So when people point to it, I'm like, this still doesn't help you, because it gets stricter as you go. Polygamy was acceptable in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, it becomes more taboo, it seems like, to Jesus. Divorce was allowed in the Old Testament, but Jesus tightened the teachings on divorce and said it's only because of the hardness of the heart was it even tolerated to begin with. Adultery is always condemned, and Christ even calls lust with the eyes adultery of the heart. He kind of ups the ante. He doesn't bring it down. He doesn't broaden it. So sex difference remains a key part to marriage and the created order. We see in Genesis 1, and it concludes in Revelation 21-22. This connects with a broader theme of bringing two different things together into divine unity. The male and female become one flesh. The ethnic people become one between Jew and Gentile. Christ, who is king, loves the church, which are his people, and the groom, loves the church, the wife. Heaven becomes one with earth in the new creation. These are all things that marriage is supposed to reflect with male and female. The coming together of male plus female is itself a signpost pointing to that great complementarity of God's whole creation of heaven and earth belonging together. And that is a quote by N.T. Wright. Okay. Man, guys, I'm tired. I should have done this all in one video, but oh well. We're going to go. All right. 15th argument is that the traditional view of marriage is harmful to homosexual people. And we've all heard this, like, well, these people experience rejection, and they, there is this idea of sexual orientation therapy, all these things, it's all harmful to us, to homosexual people. Yikes. Anyway, again, Christians shouldn't want to watch people suffer. I agree with that. It's not like I want you to sit there and suffer. But what is the cause of the harm, right? We need to ask that. Some say it's the teaching of the sexual difference that causes the harm. And it's true that parents, of course, there have been many terrible stories how Christians have dealt with this. Parents would kick out their child who comes out as same-sex attracted, or could force them into various forms of conversion therapy. However, correlation doesn't equal causation. For example, some Christians might be racist and even use the Bible to justify their racism. I've seen that a lot on X recently. It doesn't mean that the Bible is the problem. It's their interpretation and application of it that's the problem. So yes, the traditional view of marriage you might find has been hurtful in some of your churches, but that doesn't make it The problem isn't the traditional view of marriage. It might be how the church is teaching that or going about that, if that makes sense. So broad brush generalization can cause harm, right? Broad brushing Christian teaching or traditional teaching is just as damaging as broad brushing the entire LGBTQ community. So when they broad brush us, but then they get mad that we broad brush them, everyone's being a bunch of like, they're basically contradicting themselves. No one wants to be broad brushed. Okay. So there are hundreds and thousands of same-sex attracted people who believe in the Christian sexual ethic. Are they condemned too? These people don't only affirm traditional marriage, but find progressive teaching to be damaging as well. So what about them? Those who live celibate lives for the kingdom, for Jesus, because they love him that much. And they view the progressive teaching as harmful, to just give into your sexual desires and live how you want. So it's true that some Christians have, harmed some gay people. Of course, that has happened. And I've been talking about this since I joined ministry like 13 years ago. But it's also true that some non-Christians harm gay people. And it's also true that Christians help gay people. It's also true that gay people have harmed Christians. Okay. We recently saw that with that one school shooting even. So the sins of others don't justify your own sins. That's the point. So to use the sins of others to justify your own, it doesn't work. But let's test the argument. Let's see how much flex this thing has. So if we test the argument with straight people who have sex outside of marriage, some Christians have sex outside of marriage and have been deeply hurt and persecuted by their fellow Christians. Is a traditional view itself to blame for this, or is it the way in which they were punished by their peers the problem? The harm arguments, and this is the issue with the harm arguments as a whole, they seem to shift the blame rather than blaming people's poor behavior who hold to a particular idea. They quietly equate they falsely equate that with the idea that they hold to. People are not ideas, and ideas are not behaviors. The harm argument also seems to depend on believing that sex is needed for human flourishing when it's not. It's simply not. Say this is harmful for us to say you can't have sex with anyone willy-nilly is not harmful. This implies that following Jesus isn't worth it, nor is it good enough for you, that we must be able to have sex with whomever we desire in order to be happy. Affirming same-sex relationships because you equate sexuality with human flourishing is just as damaging as purity culture, which says that if one keeps their sexual purity, God will reward them with a fulfilling life by giving them their soulmate and a spouse. Both are wrong and both are damaging because they put way too much identity and value into one's sex life. That's not where your value lies. Nowhere is sex built into the promise of Christ's gospel, as I mentioned earlier. So anyway, if we adopt these cultural beliefs, if we just adopt these things like, oh, if it hurts people's feelings, that therefore we must accept it and make leniency, and we also accept this cultural belief that sex is a need, and without it, we'll be miserable human beings, will make someone put too much stock in sex and make singleness impossible, which is not okay. Because again, Jesus says, and Paul both actually say singleness is a good thing. So what will happen with many of these people is that they will get married or find a sexual partner and realize that they're just not fulfilled still. They'll get married thinking that this is going to make them happy, and they're just not. And they thought that they would be, because it turns out sex doesn't actually fulfill you. It feels good for 2 minutes. Anyway, studies on gay people also raised in Christian religious homes show a lot of things. All right. So it's true that religious, not Christian homes seem to increase suicide ideation in the LGBTQ kids, but primarily when focused on the conflict aspect. And that is often associated with conversion therapy. Okay. So don't shove your kids in conversion therapy, perhaps. LGBTQ people who identify as religious reported higher levels of happiness. Oddly enough, if you believe in higher things and things transcendent, you'll find you're happier. In the Netherlands, younger homosexual men actually had a higher suicide ideation than older homosexual men, despite being more accepting in culture. So this goes into the hot take that I think that there's more going on beneath the surface than just people not accepting you. It's more accepted now than it's ever been, yet we still see these statistics. Why is that? Is it perhaps that homosexuality could be something, an action or a psychological attraction that's going on, that there's something deeper going on with the person. And this is a way that your brain gets wired, or you wire yourself, or whatever happens that attracts you in that direction. or that the other things have happened in your life that are very difficult that you're processing that pushes you in that direction. Either way, some of the data doesn't seem to show that more acceptance would somehow make things less harmful. In fact, we see other things. Sometimes the more accepted it's been, the more we see the numbers go up. Almost like not following within God's moral framework actually causes people harm. That's what causes people more harm. So these studies give us mixed results on the harm argument as a whole. You can go through a bunch of them, you can look a bunch of things up, but some of the studies are also pretty broad, including all forms of religious experiences. So like they'll equate Islam as a religion versus Christianity and all the different denominations of Christianity as well. So some Christians also have helped hundreds of gay people not commit suicide, and others, like the Westboro Baptist Church, have done nothing but cause continual problems. So it's clear, however, that the conversion therapy and familial rejection lead to high rates of depression and suicide. So we should be careful in how we approach this with our children and with our loved ones. So remember, only a small percent, like 3% of homosexual people left to traditional teachings of marriage, but a large portion left due to rejection of others socially and familially. So 3% say that they left because of the traditional teachings. Most of the reason why people left was actually because of how they were treated. So we should just make sure we are treating people properly if they come out as same-sex attracted. Okay. All right. So some people are born gay, so it must be okay. That's the argument. It's by nature, it's inherent to them. This is what it was. But this here, there's a note, by the way, here that this argument contradicts the argument for trans people, which posits that people are in fact born with a wrong orientation. So it's kind of funny where it's like, so are you born that way or are you not born that way? But anyway, this is such a common argument that it demands its own treatment, but the answer is really, really, really simple. And I think you guys already see the flaw right away. Inborn desires do not equate to being justified or moral. So you might be born that way. You might have experienced same-sex attraction your whole life. That doesn't make it okay. One having desires doesn't suddenly make those desires moral. Christian theology teaches actually that mankind is born with sinful and evil desires that we are not to act out upon. So we're to hold to truth and rule over those desires. In fact, Genesis 4:7, anybody? Sin is knocking at the door, but you must rule over it, right? So although this argument is popular in our culture today, it's important to note that scientists, Christians and secular alike, disagree with this. The American Psychological Association, the APA, said this, and I quote, "No findings have emerged that permit scientists to conclude that sexual orientation is determined by any particular factor or factors. Many think that the nature and nurture both play complex roles." So they're saying that the sexual attraction can't be reduced to a small and simple biological factor. Rather, biology, nature, might play a role along with one's environment, their nurture. In fact, Science magazine even stated, and I quote, "The predisposition to same-sex sexual behavior appeared influenced by a complex mix of genetic and environmental influences." So just because something isn't inherited biologically doesn't mean there's a choice involved. For example, none of us choose to speak our native language, right? We can't not speak our native language. It feels innate to us. However, this is a product of our nurture, our environment. Same with our culture we're born in, or even our religion. And then it's also really important. This will make some people mad, the progressives mad, but sexual attraction is not rigid. It's not rigid. What many Christians and non-Christians fail to understand is that sexual attraction has more fluidity in it than many people might realize. Rarely is someone only attracted to one criteria, like one particular ethnic group or race, one sex or age. Typically, sexual attractions are much broader than this, attracted to various types of people, right? So in addition, oftentimes people's attractions tend to normalize over time to natural relationships like heterosexual. And that's actually what a lot of studies show. They don't like to talk about this, but a lot of studies show like a lot of girls tend to have same-sex attraction or want same-sex relationships when they're younger, but then they grow out of it over time. So it's not rigid. Dr. Lisa Diamond, in her work Sexual Fluidity, found some interesting points. She researched 100 non-straight women for 10 years. Get this. At the beginning of her study, 43% identified as lesbian, 30% as bisexual, and 27% fit no category but weren't heterosexual. Out of the 43% of lesbians, 30% ended up pursuing fulfilling romantic relationships with men, while only 3% expressed complete attractions to other women over the course of 10 years. Apparently, over 10 years, 2/3 of women actually changed their sexual identity. Research showed that they experienced different seasons of sexual attraction. Typically, they weren't huge switches, but there was variation among them. So arguments for someone's biology or nature make for weak theological arguments as well. Theology informs our biology on how we should behave with our biology, not the other way around. Innate born desires don't justify moral or immoral behavior. Because if that's the case, what if somebody wakes up and they say, well, I was born a murderer. I was born with this innate desire to kill people, or rapist. I was born with this innate desire to overpower somebody and take them sexually. You really want to go with that argument that because you desire it, it's okay? That's literally the opposite of what we should be telling people. Don't do what you desire. Do what's right, not what you want to do. Doesn't matter if you were born that way or experienced that your entire life. Okay? Same-sex marriage is on the right side of history. This is a bizarre argument. So, of course, the church has often made mistakes on resisting proper moral changes of the culture, like owning slaves, the oppression of women, fighting against civil rights. The church too often fails to realize when their views are outdated and in need of updating. The church doesn't need to update its views, by the way. The church should be believing the same stuff for 2,000 years. So no. Anyway, so this argument is making a subtle category issue and a sloppy generalization. And this is sloppy academia. So this is why the people on the thumbnail list, they're jokes. They're not serious people. So just because a talking point is popular doesn't mean it's accurate. Okay. Don't be a bumper sticker thinker. Okay. That actually is a good bumper sticker. Don't be a bumper sticker thinker. Should put on the church split shop, but I won't because I'm lazy. Anyway, racism is evil and always has been and goes against the foundational doctrine of the Imago Dei, which is God's image. Jesus spoke against it with the Good Samaritan, and Paul did so too by emphasizing that there's no Jew or Gentile, okay? So we all agree with this. Slavery is morally reprehensible as well for the same reason as the first. Many Christians fought and actually died to free slaves throughout the years. So yes, some Christians owned slaves, but many others also fought against it. So this is why it's a sloppy generalization. And some white Christians wrongfully resisted civil rights movement, but many Christians also supported it. Christians are not monolithic. Christian history has shown that there has been a lot of abuse toward women as well. This doesn't make it right, especially since Paul said that there is neither male nor female, but all are equal in Christ Jesus. However, women have been treated better in the church than any other religion, and women have flocked to the early church due to how they were venerated and respected. Same with ancient Israel. Women wanted to be part of Israel. This doesn't mean evil men haven't taken advantage nor mistreated them either, but it is important to note. So the church has mistreated many gay people and dehumanized them and shunned them. This is also true. If Christians truly want to be on the right side of history, then we need to speak up loudly against these dehumanizing efforts as a whole. All dehumanizing is bad, but we also need to accept the labels. We don't need to accept the labels often thrown at us. Some Christians are hateful. That's true, but often labeled as hateful what is often labeled as hateful simply isn't. Me disagreeing with you doesn't mean I hate you. It means I disagree with you. Any more than me disagreeing with my wife or my best friend means I hate them. Okay. There's nothing wrong with Christians believing certain lifestyles are wrong. To believe something is sinful isn't hateful toward anyone. It means that you don't think it honors God. So the church has taught the same sexual ethic for 2,000 years. We're not the bad guys for still teaching the same sexual ethic that we've taught for 2,000 years, okay? So the presupposition loaded into this argument is that it assumes history is always moving in the right direction. This, however, is demonstrably untrue. Sexual revolution. So, for example, the sexual revolution. The sexual revolution separated pleasure of sex and procreation and covenant. But what was the result? The result was that multiple children are being born in single-parent homes. There's a struggle of single mothers exists. the lack of responsibility on young men, and the objectification of women to be tools for men just to be cast aside with no commitment. Whenever we open up the boundaries of sex, it's amazing that we haven't learned our lesson from this. It's always women and children who hurt the most. So, studies prove that children are worse off in single-parent homes. The studies also show that women are less happy now than they ever were before. In addition, Louise Perry for the British Journal said, he stated that the day after pill has decreased the fear of unwanted pregnancy, which some see as a liberation, but it also resulted in women being able to engage in the type of sex womanizers desire, copious amounts of commitment-free sex. This has led women to feeling more degraded, used, and paranoid of men's intentions. This paranoia is bad for both men and women. Women don't know who they can trust, and men seeking truly good relationships are often villainized before they can even try. So again, this whole presupposition that is loaded into this that assumes that history is always moving in the right direction is just straight up false. Just because these things have opened up doesn't mean we should accept that all these things are okay. Sexual revolution has succeeded in satisfying men, but has left harmful wounds on women, children, and the family as a whole. The abuse of women is a problem throughout church history by various people, but it also fares no better in the secular world, right? We have Harvey Weinstein, Epstein, we have the entire Me Too movement, all those things, all these by progressive secular types. So you can spare me just accusing the church. Becoming secular, progressive, or voting Democrat doesn't cure the effects of sin on our sexual desires, and it won't do that. So remember, progress doesn't always result in flourishing of humanity. Sometimes we trade one bad thing for something far worse. We look at one thing, we don't like it, and we tear it down. We have no idea what's going to take its place. So again, also the Industrial Revolution is a good example. The result has been widespread advancement in technology and ease of life, right? But has also led to a massive increase in isolation, depression, anxiety, suicide, and especially young people like teenagers. Look what it's doing to our young people right now. Look at Gen Z. Read the book, The Anxious Generation. You won't regret it. Studies show there's also less violence, sexism, and racism and hunger today than ever in history. It doesn't mean everything is better and perfect, though, by every metric. So keep that in mind. So again, there's some wrongful comparisons here. Some progressive people make poor comparisons. They will compare the resistance of same-sex relationships to the resistance of the civil rights movement. In other words, they'll compare gay relationships with racism. This is a problem. And I feel like every single person who fought in the civil rights movement, I feel like everyone who benefited from the civil rights movement should be actually like very offended by this, because race is something innate to a person. It is not a moral category. You're not morally different because you're black, white, yellow, whatever. Okay, your ethnicity, your race is like a single scale. Like it is morally neutral. It is amoral. So what we are discussing here is a matter of sexual ethics. The color of someone's skin has nothing to do with sexual ethics. It's not helpful to compare sexual ethics to the issue of sexism or racism, because race and sex are things you're born with, and those are things that are innate to your body. They're not moral categories. Okay, all right. Then my favorite is, if you bring all this up, they're inevitably going to say, well, Christians are a bunch of hypocrites anyway, right? Christians are against same-sex relationships and they call them sinful, but they never speak about other sins like divorce, gluttony, fornication, and porn. And of course, the obvious solution here is that if they are all truly sins, then the solution isn't to turn a blind eye to a sin and enable it, is to condemn all the sin as a whole. So, the argument isn't really an argument for same-sex marriage, but rather a distraction. This is what we call a red herring. So as soon as they bring it up, like, well, this is wrong. Well, Christians are hypocrites. Okay, great. Yeah, they are. It doesn't mean that this is right. There's no logical, ethical, biblical, or philosophical reason to support same-sex marriage presented in this argument. Just because Christians are hypocrites does not suddenly make same-sex relationships okay. It just means that, okay, we need to condemn more sin. Do you want us to start doing that? You might not like it when we stop being hypocrites. when Christians stop contradicting themselves and start living fully sold out lives for Jesus and start condemning all sin as a whole, you might wish you never said that. Anyway, God isn't going to look at his followers and say, well, since you all mistreated your spouses and ate too much and drank too much, then I think we ought to reconsider what I said about homosexual relationships. It's not going to happen. Okay. However, even though divorce grieves the heart of God and should only be used in the worst situations, God still gave times where he gave permission to have divorce. He never did that with homosexuality. Okay. There is a difference, though, between churches that struggle with, between churches and people who struggle with sin and those who cover it up, enable it, or even celebrate it. And that's what you're asking us to do: enable it and celebrate it. We shouldn't do that. It's bad if we cover up our sin, but it's not okay for us to ever celebrate it or enable it. Again, woe unto those who call evil good and good evil, right? So anyway, and this one, of course, is a bumper sticker, but you hear it often. Love is love. God is love. Therefore, God wants his image bearers to experience love as well. There's no difference between opposite sex love and same sex love. Of course, if that's, it's true that, of course, one of the most basic human needs and desires is love, and that all mankind deserves love. That is true, no matter where you're at. But the truth is, Christian love, known as agape love, unconditional love, is to be the utter core of the Christian faith. This love is often called unconditional love, and its intention is to be genuine, Christ-like, countercultural, courageous, powerful, life-changing, scandalous, and counterintuitive. And it's not talking about you being able to have same-sex relationships. You can look at 1 Corinthians 13 to get a really good example of what that looks like. And the main problem with this sort of argument for sexual ethics is it's a reflection of love. Main problem here is that sexual ethics is a reflection of love properly understood. So the way we go about our sexual ethic should reflect love properly, not how we think love should be. The Bible talks a lot about love, but it also talks a lot about sexual ethics, and those sexual ethics is what helps us define what love is. Not just pleasing a base sexual desire, but also reflecting God's intention for creation, marriage, family, all that stuff. God created sex and created it to be a good thing, but love is so much more than sex. A big issue with this argument is that it rightly emphasizes love, but wrongly defines it. God tells us to love the outsiders. That doesn't mean to have sex with them, right? God tells us to love our neighbors as ourselves. That doesn't mean to have sex with them. God tells us to love him, but that doesn't mean to have sexual desires for him, right? Love doesn't mean sex. So love in the Bible is thankfully not just a sexual encounter. In fact, one of the radical teachings of the Bible is how love is separate from sex and separate from feelings, but rather love is an action. So this actually completely goes contrary to this idea of love is love. God defines what love is. Love is an action, and love is not sex. Thank God it's not sex, because that would mean that there's a lot of people out there who never experienced love. And love is so much more than sex. When you're making love, it's using the love as love line, you are like demeaning what love really is. All right. We're almost through the notes. All right. Some people just say, well, it's an agree to disagree issue on Christian liberty, like Romans 14, Genesis, 1 Corinthians 8. It's worth noting that Christian liberty, of course, is a real thing, but it's also good to hang, and it's good to hang around with people with diverse viewpoints and stuff. But here's the reality. Despite certain things being a liberty issue, like drinking, meat before idols and stuff like that Paul talks about, some things are clear on what is right and what is wrong in the eyes of God. And we should not be trying to justify those things. God's first institution was marriage, and God treats it as a foundational part to the biblical narrative. The very foundation of marriage is woven within the fabric of creation itself. Reproduction, our own chemical balances, family, society, all these things are all deeply impacted by marriage to the opposite sex. So just because people disagree on this topic doesn't suddenly make it a gray area. People can disagree. That doesn't make it gray. One must first examine the arguments for themselves, as we're doing right now, in light of scripture, history, and the modern spirit, and then go, does this make any sense whatsoever? They have to be judged by their own merit, not just, don't get to just claim that every disagreement is a liberty issue. All earliest Christians, those who affirm the Orthodox Creed and those who didn't endorse same-sex marriage. Not a single one of them. So those who disagreed with the creeds and those who agreed, every single one, every theologian, 500 years before or after Jesus, all agree on this. Thousands of years after Jesus, all agreed that this was the case. So in the earliest Christian creedal statements is found in Acts 15:29. It says that you will abstain for the sacrifice of idols, blood, and yes, porneia, sexual immorality. So again, the burden of proof is on those making this liberty argument. Where in the Bible is sexual immorality ever an agree to disagree issue? Especially with the teachings from Jesus. So, few notes. There are no disputes regarding this matter in the early church or Judaism. Make sure that you remember that. This has been universally accepted as the proper teaching, which is homosexuality is not permissible in the eyes of the Lord. So, now let's get to this one right here. So I screwed up one of these. I'm going to, there we go. Boop. So the traditional sexual ethic isn't livable for same-sex attracted people. Now it's just not livable, right? That's what they'll say. Like, this is too much to expect from somebody. But often believers who have same-sex attraction know the reality. The Bible teaches traditional marriage. However, the issue they ask is, can I live this way? That's the question that they're asking. And notice what Jesus says in Mark 10. Jesus promised that, truly I say to you, that no one who has left his house or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or lands for my sake and for the gospel, who will not receive 100-fold now in this time and in the age to come, which is eternal life. So if people are forsaking what they could have here on this earth and all that, they will be rewarded. And that's a good thing. So therefore, as someone who might, if you're same-sex attracted, this is something that is good for you to have experience and also to give over to God, because you will be rewarded. Christians ought to focus on the eternal life aspect of this passage and not on this life passage. That to give up all earthly pleasures for heaven will make it worth it. But Jesus doesn't say that exclusively. This is a constrained view of the gospel. The Christian life certainly includes this, but it's more than this. Jesus says here that those who leave their biological families and earthly treasures here for him will, here in this present age, will inherit these rewards. Many same-sex attracted individuals who have lost their family and friends due to their attractions, and God promises them a spiritual family, so long as they, of course, live a godly life. Having same-sex attraction doesn't make you sinful. It's how you act on those things that is. So saying it's not livable is just, again, not true. Jesus tells us to forsake our desires all the time. So since many same-sex attracted individuals who become Christian swear into a life of celibacy, like no sex ever, they won't ever have a family, like children. Many of those people, when asked about their greatest fear, will say that I don't know who will take care of me when I'm old. And that's when the Christians should answer the call and go, you know what? You have given your life over to Jesus. You experience exclusive same-sex attraction. So therefore, what I am going to do is we are going to come alongside you to support you. Be good Christians, right? Support people who are making good ethical decisions. Don't make it more difficult for them. Many Christians get mad at people when they say that they're same-sex attracted or when they say that they're gay, even if they live in celibate. They say that, that shouldn't be your identity anymore. Jesus is. Yeah, that's true, but it doesn't mean they don't experience those attractions. It's just like, what do you get mad at somebody when you find out that they have a porn addiction or a porn problem or lust problem? That should be your thing anymore. Jesus should be the one. Like, no, you still have those issues. Doesn't mean your identity is still not in Jesus, but it just means you're still going to struggle with those things. Preston Sprinkle put it this way. He said, I passionately believe in the Creator's design for marriage and sexual expression. And I think that the Creator has revealed this design to us clearly in Scripture. This argument doesn't actually critique a traditional theology of marriage. It critiques the manner in which the church fails to embody the holistic vision of Christ, who died to form a radical family where all kinds of people will call on one another, will call one another brother and sister and father and mother. When the church lives out the whole gospel of Christ, the countercultural sexual ethic of Christ actually is livable and good and beautiful and compelling. So yeah, churches need to just live this out and be the companions for these people and help them actually realize it is livable, they will be okay, and everything will work out. So again, there's not much to respond to here, but that there is a tension in having to live a life for Christ, separated unto him, and denying the desires of our flesh. That's difficult. So another argument that you'll run into is that Leviticus is referring to young boys. So because there's that argument about arsena coites and like the power dynamics, but some people will even go to Leviticus to try to make that argument. Not a very good argument. All right. He says in Leviticus 18:22, again, you shall not lie with a male as one lies with a female. It is abomination. The progressive argues that this argument is actually usually presented as a male, meaning a general word, thus referring to young boys as well. So it could be referring to young boys. So you must not lie with young boys as one lies with a woman. But the proper view is that zakar is the word for male, and it means human or animal alike. It is general male, like how we say male. That's what it's referring to. This is not indicative of age or species, just general. You're a male. All right. And Isha is woman or wife, which is always female generally. It is inductive of age and means full grown human female. So you, male, shall not lie with you shall not lie with a male as you do with a fully grown woman. So a male of any age, you will not lie with him as you would lie with an actual grown woman, is what it's saying. So it's saying do not have sexual relations with a male of any kind as you would with a fully grown woman. Because here's what's funny, is that this is another thing that they seem to ignore when it comes to the biblical text. When it comes to Hebrew is a very deep language. It has many, many, many specific words to deal with specific ages. For example, a boy child was Yeled. A female, which is a general woman, general female, I should say, not a woman, general female, is Nekiba, or Nekiba. Girl child is Yalda. Youth man, so a young man, like a teenager, would be Na'ar, and a young woman would be Alma. And then you have, like I said, Isha, which is woman, fully grown woman, Isha. And you have men, right? So Adam, or Adam, being man. And then, as I mentioned a second ago, you have, Zakar, yeah, which is male as a whole. Anyway, so there are actual examples of this. You also hear people say this, well, Sodom and Gomorrah's sin doesn't mention homosexuality. I actually use this against my fundamentalist brothers and sisters back in the day, because I was like, you guys rant and rave about this all the time, but this is actually what the main sin is. But also, it's not really a good argument. Like, honestly, that was when I was young and dumb and didn't know any better. But anyway, Ezekiel 16:49-50. Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom, her daughters in her pride, excess food, prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. They were haughty and did an abomination before me. So I removed them when I saw it. So the progressive view is that it doesn't mention homosexuality at all. I even used to point this out. But the proper view, though, is, does it have to actually specify the sin itself? I mean, after all, it says Lot even says that what they plan to do is wicked to his family, right? He mentions abominations, that they do these abominations before me. Well, that's a pretty broad category, right? Abominations. And homosexuality would be part of that. It would fall under that. If that which displeases God. God has already stated his view about this. Thus, homosexuality falls under the umbrella of abomination. Read Leviticus 18, all right? Read Leviticus 20. And then I already mentioned this earlier, but I do feel like it does require its own segment. Arsena coite and malakoi are mistranslated. And I already read those verses earlier, so you can reference back to that, but it's in 1 Corinthians 6:9 and 1 Timothy 1:10. And what they will say is that something like malakoi means soft. It is referring to the softness of a child's skin or a softness of a child's body. Thus, it is referring to pedophilia. However, malakoi means soft because it's actually talking about being a soft man. That's actually what it's referring to culturally. A man who has betrayed his masculine role and is not acting, and is now taking the submissive role in a same-sex relationship. And this was viewed as very negative. This is why it says a man shall not wear that which pertains to a woman, because it was popular in the Babylonians to like prostitute young boys and present them as girls. That was considered being malakoi. That was considered being soft. You were a soft man. And again, arsenokoite means male bedders or male bed. Even if malakoi meant boy prostitutes, the word of arsenokoites gets rid of any form of ambiguity. It's male, general, bedders, men who bed other men who have sex with other men. So again, as a term Paul coined himself by taking from Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13. And even Revelation 22:15 refers to male prostitutes as dogs. This should be quite telling to us when it's talking about malakoi. It's all considered bad. Okay? All right. So in conclusion, the term malakoi, arsenokoite, is brought up in Romans 1 and other places, and too many people want to say that it means male with a boy, but that is simply not true. And again, it's a sin because it's a perversion of God's his natural order. So the Western lie in our world today that we all need to be on the lookout for is that the Western lie is that you're not, that if you're not hurting someone, there's nothing wrong with it. But that's how not homorality works, because people are like, oh, there's nothing wrong. Homosexuality is not hurting anybody. But it's not whether you are physically hurting somebody. It's whether or not you are living up to your vocation, your created purpose. Your body has a purpose. Your life has a purpose. Your hands have, like my hands are clearly designed to grip and grab things, right? Like there's a purpose for that. My hands were intended to bless, but I could also use them for very violent and selfish means, right? Well, then I'm perverting their use. And just because I might be perverting the use of my hands, but I don't physically hurt somebody, doesn't mean suddenly what I'm doing is okay. All right. So those are the arguments. Those are the arguments all refuted. And so I want to make sure that I just quickly reiterate the image of God principle. Sexuality in the Old Testament is most importantly a result of Yahweh's created order in Genesis 1. But God created humankind in the image of God as male and female and instructed them to be fruitful and multiply. Okay. And so that's by Matthew Beale. We are created in the image of God with a very particular intention, and we need to live up to that intention. We also need to recognize that people who are LGBTQ are image bearers of God, and we should be working to give them the light of the gospel. And if somebody you know is living a life holy to God, even though they're same-sex attracted, that's awesome. It should be praised, and you need to be their community. You need to be their family, because they might not have one, or they might not have one in the future because they don't have kids and stuff. So anyway, that is that. Oh, what's up, Braxton? I didn't even see you in the chat. Hi, buddy. Wow, you're up late. Okay. This is not a liberty issue. Yeah, that's absolutely true. All right, guys. So go ahead and we'll start Q&A and responses now. So this is the gayest thing Will's ever talked about. It's so stupid. Hypocrite is an overused word. It really is being used to other people in the church when that really is being pointed out is inconsistency. Everyone is inconsistent, including those foisting hypocrite. Exactly. Very true. Any questions? Does everyone feel like that was thorough enough, by the way, for everyone? Did he go over whether or not the attraction itself is a sin? I mentioned that before. Yeah, the attraction itself is not a sin. We don't control our attractions. I didn't wake up one day and go, I am attracted to a Korean woman. Like, no, I've always been attracted to Asian women and brunettes. I don't know why. Doesn't mean I don't find anyone else ever attracted, but I definitely have a type. There's nothing wrong with experiencing the attraction, but it's what you do with the attraction that matters. Oh yeah. Yeah, Nick right here. Was Paul just wrong? Why can't a progressive just say that? They can say that. They can just be like, oh, I think Paul was wrong. He was a racist, sexist, bigoted, homophobe, and I don't like him. Of course, the problem is with that is that now you have gone against, and you already know this, Nick. You've now gone against the entire teaching of the church that has recognized Paul as an authoritative apostle, as someone who has written our New Testament, as someone who has expressed all the things that we've ever learned. Yeah, and I'm not going to do the whole like God breathed thing there, because I don't think Paul knew he was writing scripture necessarily. But I don't. Yeah, I would just say you are completely unorthodox, and now it's on you to somehow show that the Christian faith has had Paul wrong this entire time. Plus, most of everyone's doctrines and understanding of the Christian faith and how God relates with us in their Christian faith is from Paul. So it's like a lot of people want a lot of the teachings of Paul, but then they want to get rid of his teachings when it doesn't fit their sensibilities. And yeah, so yeah, other disciples recognize him as authoritative. Bingo. Question: if sin is a contamination instead of a moral corruption, does that mean that sin should be treated as a disease and the church as a hospital instead of condemning people for a corruption? Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much what I encourage people to do is like, hey, this is we don't, the sin corrupts us, it corrupts our nature, it corrupts our desires and all that. This is why you're here. This is why you need to be healed. This is why you need to become more like Christ and reflect his image. That's why I say the church should be incarnational, and that because Christ is incarnational, became like man, then the church needs to become more and more like Christ. So I don't think so. Nick, does Isaiah 53 teach PSA? Shut your mouth, Nick. You know it doesn't. All right, let's see here. Nathan says, here's an issue I came across in my devotions in Ephesians. In Ephesians 4:8, Paul quotes Psalm 68:18 as part of his argument, but he changes what the Old Testament passages said, which affects the argument. Well, it's a 5-4 earlier. Man, we're doing a lot of like hanging out and inside he led a host of captives captive, and he gave gifts to men. And then Psalm, what is it? 68:18. Hey, I should have trusted my memory. I was actually right. Psalm 68:18. You ascended on high, leading a host of captives in your train and receiving gifts among men, having among the rebellious that the Lord have endured. I'm guessing this is like a translational thing. The Septuagint as well would have different verbiage, and we see Paul quote different things, so I don't think it's actually a huge issue. So yeah, I'm so surprised I'm still here. Braxton, what are you doing still here? How's that revival going though? You getting people to repent and come to Jesus? So time for Braxton to drop a $1,000 super chat right now. Just kidding. All right. Did Paul write 1 Corinthians 13:34-35 because he sounds sexist and contradictory and all that? 1 Corinthians 14:34-35. Which part is this one? The women should keep silent in the churches. What's sexist about that? They should keep silent. You just felt every woman try to punch me in the face. Isn't that the one that's not in the earliest text? Is that the passage that's not in the earliest text? That might be the passage. But also, I think when it's talking about keeping silent in the church, they are not permitted to speak, but they should be in submission, as the law also says. If there's anything that they desire to learn, that they should learn from their husband. I think that isn't there's a whole Mishnah actually that's kind of related to that too. So, and it's obviously not talking about women can't speak at all in the church, because women speak in church all the time and they always have. So I think that is dealing with a certain thing. Oh, good. Glad it went really well, Braxton. Love that for you. This was a crazy, Braxton, you probably weren't here at the beginning of the stream, but this was crazy. It started off a little rough. I had students here, you would know them. And one of their batteries died, so they had to interrupt me midstream. I thought they had all gone. It was almost 10 o'clock, and they're like, our car needs a jump. So anyway, I gave them my keys, so I have to go edit that out. I blame the boys. Anyway, how long do you want the lecture for why you are wrong to be when I get there? Keep talking. I'm taking notes. Preferably not at all, because I think that you should hold the 1 Corinthians 14:34-35 and not speak. Got him. All right. So how does that joke get old? Because I don't think it ever gets old. I think it's hilarious. Women should be quiet when other women are preaching. Yeah. Nick, your egalitarianism is showing. So yeah, it was actually you would totally know them. It was Jiranowski's boy, because of course it was, and he's just like, I'm so sorry. I'm like, yep, interrupt my stream, boy. Anyway, it's so funny. He's a good kid. I love him. He's great. I saw that the live chat got spicy. Crazy. I'm surprised that Amber hasn't bickered about more of my Hebrew so far. My pronunciation, I'm sure, was abysmal. I always struggle with that, but it's fine. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine. Everything's fine. Does anyone have a question? More questions? Oh, wait. I saw one. Will, you aren't using the proper eisegesis with neo-Marxist and CT framework. Come on. It's what liberal scholars are using these days. Here, I thought she was actually going to correct me, but it's always nice when Amber says I'm right. Did I see super chat in there? So Will isn't a progressive? Wow, stop the presses. Thank you. Right? It's that's what annoys me when people like Mike Winger and others are just like, yeah, this progressive non-penal substitution theology, these are progressive people. I'm like, bro, do you even know me? Like, they don't know me. That's part of the problem. Okay, I think that okay, I did get the super chat. That was the one from earlier. Okay, good. I want to make sure somebody didn't throw money and I just screw up. Oh, I did. I posted that it was horrible. That's fine. If I don't care. So do you want Hebrew lessons? Your Hebrew pronunciation is horrible. Yes, sure. Let me know. I'm actually about ready to take some Hebrew, so it'll be good. I always hate I like Hebrew is always the one where I look at it, I'm like, this could go really, really right or really, really wrong, you know. Anyway. Cool. But yeah, it is really funny how these people really do not care about exegesis and doing proper historical study, doing all those things. It's like the amount of things they ignore to reach their conclusions is nothing short of astounding to me. So it's weird that Timu Mike isn't a progressive when Mike Prime makes clear he is based on his PSA stance. Well, you know, you can't win them all. I just wish that you know, people just stop calling me progressive because like I detest that label. Like if anyone knows me, like knows me well, they know I'm pretty freaking conservative and I'm like more the like really based in some of those departments. My wife actually will just make fun of me because she's like, yeah, he's on this whole kick right now is listening to so and so and he halfway agrees with it. So it's just funny. But anyway. I really do hope that this video serves kind of as first, why not in the same in Romans 1 time? Wait, 1 Corinthians 11, 14 through 15. I'm about ready to ground you, Nick. I don't want to deal with it. Why you ask the questions? Oh, that one, the long hair nature and all that. Look, I'm not the Pauline expert. Okay, you are. But is by nature these things. Well, the answer to your question would be that Romans 1:26-27 posits that it is actually against nature. So short hair is natural for men and long hair natural for women, and same-sex relationships are unnatural. So you can appeal to nature just fine, but Paul says it's against nature. So you can't, your desires aren't necessarily nature. Just because you desire something or you have certain inclinations towards something doesn't suddenly mean that you get to justify it. No, the opposite is quite true. Like my eyes have a design for them. I don't get to just say, well, I don't like my eyes, so I'm going to gouge them out. Like, no. So yeah, appealing to nature, it means the design of something, the ontology of a thing, the telos of a thing, not necessarily the desire of the person. Question, where are we getting everyone together for dinner? It's a great question. There's a few places around here. I'm not the foodie though. Braxton's the foodie. We have to let Braxton choose. Definitely the wrong label. Yeah. All right. So, well, guys, I think unless anyone has other questions or going to throw a super chat in here, I think I'm about ready to log off because it's almost midnight and I have to like record a sermon tomorrow for Sunday because I'm preaching on Sunday and I have a mission trip where I'm gone all next week. So no live stream next week for all you guys. Denny's? Ew, no. I am morally opposed to this. I am shocked that a Christian man would ever suggest Denny's. Denny's is the only place you go. You only go to Denny's when you're nursing a hangover. That's the only reason why anyone ever goes to Denny's. So, You're coming to ETS Denver in 2026. I would like to. We'll see what happens. All right. So Evansville has no good food options. Actually, that's mostly true. So I don't know, dude. Grand Rapids has some of the best food as well. But I bet you California's got great food. Or if you have 5 children, you can take advantage of the free deals on Tuesday. Okay, I find that acceptable because I like free stuff. Don't knock Denny's for us large families. No, I'll give them a bone. If they're helping large families, they're actually doing good work. Okay, well, maybe I like them a little bit better now. So, wait, what? Not Portland? The food is mid here. Are you in Portland? Midwest folks never graduated beyond the Brits and their use of salt and pepper. You haven't been to Grand Rapids. It shows. It's amazing. They literally have like the top rated bar in the nation in Michigan. Started there. It's called Hopcat. Look it up. Anyway, all right, guys, I'm logging off. This has been fun. I'm exhausted and tired. Share the video around. Like the video if you haven't liked it already. Comment Cameron Creekmore just goes, what's up, guys? Guess what, dude? You missed the party. We're leaving. I'm tired. I've been going for 2.5 hours, just reciting one argument after another, refuting. I just wanted one place where I could point people to say, I addressed all that here. And I'll go back later, put the chapters in. I have to edit a few parts out, like when the boys came knocking in the room and all that stuff. But anyway. All right, guys. Love you all. Peace out. I'll see you in the next one. Again, no live stream next week because I will be in Asheville. We're helping hurricane relief. That's what I'm doing. What is time? I'm half dead. All right, guys. Have a good night. I'll see you in the next one. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ dwell with you all richly. See ya.